A millionaire found a little beggar girl kneeling and crying while cleaning his garden. What he does next is surprising. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the unkempt gardens of Blackwood Manor, where Alexander Montgomery walked his usual solitary path. His footsteps echoed against the cracked stone walkway, each step a reminder of the years that had passed since laughter last filled these grounds. The once majestic garden, now overgrown and withered, stretched before him like a canvas of regret. At 72, Alexander's tall frame still carried the bearing of the successful businessman he had been, though his shoulders now stooped slightly under the weight of memories. His silver hair impeccably combed, and his tailored suit spoke of wealth, but his eyes held a darkness that no amount of money could brighten. The garden had once been his pride, a symphony of colors and scents that his wife Catherine had lovingly cultivated. Now, like everything else in his life, it lay in ruins, a testament to his inability to preserve what truly mattered. The rose bushes, once pristine and orderly, had grown wild and thorny. The fountain at the center stood silent, its basin dry and cracked, home only to fallen leaves and forgotten dreams. As he rounded the corner of the east wing, something caught his eye, movement where there should have been none. Alexander stopped, his hand tightening around his walking stick. There, kneeling in the dirt before a patch of withered flowers, was a small figure he had never seen before. A girl, no more than 12, was digging in the earth with her bare hands. Her dark hair fell in waves around her face, and her simple dress was smudged with soil. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she worked, her movements desperate yet determined. "Who are you?" Alexander's voice cracked through the evening air like thunder. "This is private property." The girl startled, scrambling to her feet. She clutched something at her neck, a necklace that caught the dying sunlight. Alexander's heart skipped a beat as recognition flickered in his mind. "That pendant. I'm sorry," she stammered, taking a step backward. "I didn't mean to trespass. It's just the garden." Her voice trembled, but her eyes met his with an intensity that struck him. They were the same shade of green as his son's had been. "The garden is beyond saving," Alexander said, more harshly than he intended. "Just like everything else here." The girl shook her head, her hand still clasped. "Around the pendant, nothing is beyond saving if someone cares enough to try," she replied, with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "These flowers, they're still alive underneath. They just need someone to believe in them." Alexander moved closer, his attention fixed on the pendant. It was a simple silver piece, elegant in its design, a musical note wrapped around a rose. He had commissioned it himself 20 years ago, as a gift for his son Thomas's 16th birthday. "That necklace," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get it?" The girl's fingers tightened around the pendant. "It was my father's," she said quietly. "He gave it to me before—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "My name is Emma Montgomery." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alexander's feet. His grip on the walking stick became white-knuckled as the implications of her words crashed over him. Thomas's child, his granddaughter, the daughter of the woman he had forbidden his son to marry, the choice that had driven the final wedge between them. "That's impossible," he breathed, but even as he spoke, he could see Thomas in every feature of her face. "Your father passed away 3 years ago," Emma finished softly. "And Mom, she's been ill. She told me about this place, about you, about the garden that used to be the most beautiful in the county." She looked around at the withered landscape. "I had to see it for myself." Alexander stared at the child before him, this living bridge to the son he had lost. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the garden. In the fading light, he could see dirt under her fingernails, determination in her stance, and hope in her eyes, hope he had long since abandoned. "You should leave," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "This is no place for a child." Emma stood her ground, chin lifted in a gesture so reminiscent of Thomas that it made Alexander's chest ache. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "And this garden, it needs someone to care for it again, like my father used to tell me you once did." The mention of Thomas's memories of him, memories he had shared with his daughter, struck Alexander like a physical blow. He looked at the darkening sky, then at the massive empty house behind him, its windows like vacant eyes staring out, at nothing. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his heart, a flicker of possibility of change. "It's getting dark," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion he refused to show. "You can't stay out here in the garden all night." Emma's eyes widened slightly, hope blooming across her features. "Does that mean—" "We'll discuss this inside," Alexander cut her off, already turning toward the house. "After you've washed that dirt off your hands and had something to eat." As he led the way back to the mansion, Alexander could hear Emma's footsteps behind him, light and quick like the first raindrops of a spring shower. For the first time in years, the silence of Blackwood Manor was about to be broken, and with it, perhaps, the walls he had built around his heart. The grand foyer of Blackwood Manor hadn't seen a visitor in over a decade, and the sound of Emma's footsteps echoing against the marble floors seemed to wake the sleeping giants of memory. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears above them, their sparkle dulled by years of dust. Portraits of stern-faced Montgomerys watched their descent into the heart of the house, their eyes following the unlikely pair, the severe old man and the dirt-smudged child who bore their blood. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had stubbornly refused to abandon her post even as the house fell into disrepair, appeared like a ghost in the doorway of the kitchen. Her eyes widened at the sight of Emma, and her hand flew to her chest in surprise. "Mr. Montgomery?" she questioned, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "Prepare a room in the east wing," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying the weight of years of unquestioned authority. "And bring dinner for two to the small dining room." Emma stood in the center of the foyer, taking in the grandeur around her. Her eyes were drawn to a particular portrait, a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile holding a violin. Her father. Alexander watched as she approached the painting, her hand unconsciously reaching for the pendant around her neck. "He was wonderful with that violin," Emma said softly, her voice filled with pride and loss. "He taught music to children before—" She trailed off, then turned to face Alexander. "Did you know he continued teaching even after he left?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "The dining room is this way," he said, avoiding both the question and the accusation in her eyes. But as he led her through the house, he couldn't help but notice how she traced her fingers along the wooden panels, how her eyes drank in every detail, as if trying to piece together the story of her father's childhood. The small dining room, despite its name, could have seated 20 comfortably. Now it felt cavernous with just the two of them. Mrs. Henderson brought soup and fresh bread, her eyes constantly darting between Alexander and the child who so clearly belonged to the family she had served for decades. "Your mother," Alexander said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "You said she's ill." Emma nodded, carefully spooning her soup. "She's in the hospital. They say—" She paused, gathering her courage. "They say she needs expensive treatments. I've been staying with our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, but she's elderly herself and can't— I had nowhere else to go." Alexander studied his granddaughter across the table. She held herself with a dignity beyond her years, despite the circumstances that had driven her to seek out a grandfather she had never met. He could see Catherine in her too, something in the set of her mouth, the grace of her movements. "And you thought coming here would solve your problems?" he asked, his voice sharp with defensive anger. "No," Emma replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I came here because Mom always said that despite everything, this place was where love grew. In the garden, in the music room, in every corner where my father played his violin. She said even when things got hard, the flowers always bloomed here." Her words struck something deep within Alexander, bringing forth memories he had long suppressed. Catherine in the garden, singing as she pruned the roses. Thomas practicing his violin by the fountain, the music floating through the summer air. The day he had given Thomas the pendant, full of hopes for his son's future, hopes that had shattered against the reef of his own pride. "Your father made his choice," Alexander said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "And you made yours," Emma responded quietly. But I'm making mine now. The garden can bloom again. The music can come back. I may not have anywhere else to go, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because this is where I belong." The conviction, in her voice so like Thomas's when he had defended his love for Emma's mother, made Alexander's hands tremble slightly. He set down his spoon, trying to gather his thoughts. "And what makes you think you can restore that garden? It's been neglected for years. The soil is poor, the plants are wild. It would take more than a child's determination to bring it back to life." Emma's eyes lit up with a familiar fire. "I've been studying horticulture with Mrs. Chen. She has the most beautiful garden in our neighborhood. And I have this." She pulled a worn notebook from her small backpack. Mom kept Dad's garden. Journals. All his notes about the flowers here, about the special roses he and Grandmother bred together. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known Thomas had kept such detailed records, hadn't known he had continued to care about the garden, even after leaving. The revelation sent a shaft of pain through his heart. "Even if I let you stay," he said slowly, "even if I allowed you to work on the garden, there are no guarantees. Things that are broken don't always mend." "But they never mend if we don't try," Emma countered, opening the journal to reveal pages of careful notes in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "Look, he wrote about the night-blooming jasmine by the east wall, about the hybrid tea roses that Grandmother loved so much. It's all here. We just have to be brave enough to begin." As Mrs. Henderson cleared away their dishes, Alexander watched. Emma poring over the journal, her finger tracing her father's words with reverence. The house seemed different with her in it, less like a mausoleum of memories, and more like something that could, perhaps, come alive again. "We'll discuss terms in the morning," he said finally, rising from his chair. "Mrs. Henderson will show you to your room." As Emma gathered her things, she paused. "Grandfather," she said, testing the word carefully. "Thank you. Not just for dinner, but for listening. Dad always said you were a good listener when your heart was open." Alexander turned away, unable to bear the weight of her gratitude or the memory of his son's kind words. But as he walked through the dark halls to his study, he could have sworn he heard the faint echo of violin music, calling him back to a time when love flowed as freely as music through the halls of Blackwood Manor. The first rays of morning. Light filtered through the dusty windows of Emma's new room, casting a golden glow across the antique furniture. She had barely slept, too excited and nervous about what the day might bring. The room, though obviously unused for years, held traces of a past life. Faded ballet shoes hung on a hook, sheet music scattered across a desk, and a collection of pressed flowers in an old book. As she made her way downstairs, Emma heard voices coming from Alexander's study. She paused at the door, not meaning to eavesdrop, but drawn by the tension in the voices. "Mr. Montgomery, you can't possibly be serious about letting her stay," a man's voice insisted. "Think about the legal implications. The press would have a field day if they found out." "Richard," Alexander's voice carried that same authoritative tone from yesterday. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on this matter. As your lawyer, it's my duty to advise you," Richard continued. "This girl shows up out of nowhere claiming to be Thomas's daughter. Have you considered she might be an imposter? There are plenty of people who would love to get their hands on the Montgomery fortune." Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. She clutched her father's garden journal tighter to her chest, fighting back tears. The doubt in the lawyer's voice cut deep, but it was Alexander's response that made her freeze. "She has his pendant, Richard, the one I had custom made. And more than that, she has his eyes, his spirit. When she talks about the garden," Alexander's voice softened, "she knows things only Thomas would have told her." The sound of footsteps approaching the door sent Emma scrambling back, nearly colliding with Mrs. Henderson, who was carrying a breakfast tray. "Oh, good morning, Miss Emma," the housekeeper said warmly, keeping her voice low. "I was just bringing you breakfast in your room, but since you're up, perhaps you'd like to eat in the conservatory. It needs some attention, but it's still the brightest room in the house on mornings like this." Emma nodded gratefully, following Mrs. Henderson through the maze of corridors. The conservatory was a magnificent glass-enclosed space attached to the east wing of the mansion. Though dusty and overgrown, the morning sun streamed through the windows, creating a magical atmosphere. Vines had taken over one corner, and several potted plants had grown wild, their branches reaching toward the light. "Your grandmother used to take her morning tea here," Mrs. Henderson said, setting down the tray on a wrought-iron table. "She would sit for hours, planning her garden designs and composing music. Did you know she was a composer?" Emma shook her head, eagerly absorbing this new information about her family. "Dad rarely talked about her. I think it made him too sad. But he did teach me to play the piano." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up. "The piano? Oh, it's still in the music room, though it hasn't been played in years. Your grandmother would be so pleased to know music runs in your blood." As Emma ate her breakfast, Mrs. Henderson shared stories about the house's glory days. She learned about the grand parties her grandparents had hosted, where musicians from around the world would perform in the garden, how the conservatory would be filled with exotic flowers, and how the air would be thick with the perfume of roses and the sound of violins. "Your father was the heart of those gatherings," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "He could light up a room with his music. Even Mr. Montgomery would smile then." A shadow fell across the table, and both Emma and Mrs. Henderson looked up to find Alexander standing in the doorway. The housekeeper quickly excused herself, leaving grandfather and granddaughter alone in the sunlit space. "I see you've discovered Catherine's sanctuary," Alexander said, his eyes scanning the overgrown plants. "She would spend every morning here, saying the light helped her think clearly." Emma gathered her courage. "I heard you talking to your lawyer," she admitted, "about me being an imposter." Alexander's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "And what do you think about that?" "I think," Emma said, carefully, "that if you really believed I was lying, you wouldn't have let me stay the night." She opened her father's journal to a particular page and held it out to him. "And I think you might recognize this." Alexander took the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he read the page. It was a pressed flower, a unique hybrid rose with petals that faded from deep purple to white. Beside it, Thomas had written, "Dad's Pride, the rose that won." The International Garden Show of 1995. Mom's last creation before she fell ill, never seen another like it. "Catherine's Twilight," Alexander whispered, touching the dried petals with reverence. "We never registered the hybrid. It was meant to be, but then she became ill and everything changed." "Dad wrote that you still have the original bush somewhere in the garden," Emma said. "He drew a map." She flipped to another page, showing a detailed sketch of the garden's layout. "If it's still alive, we could propagate it. Bring it back." Alexander studied the map, then looked at Emma with new eyes. "You understand that even if we find it, there's no guarantee it survived all these years of neglect." Emma stood up, gathering her dishes onto the tray. "Nothing in life is guaranteed, grandfather, but Dad also wrote that this rose was special, that it could survive almost anything, like love, like family." A long moment passed as Alexander considered her words. Finally, he straightened his shoulders, decision made. "Very well. After you've cleaned up, meet me in the garden, bring the journal, and wear proper shoes this time. If we're going to do this, we'll do it right." As Emma hurried to her room to change, her heart lighter than it had been in months, she didn't notice Alexander lingering in the conservatory. He walked to a particular vine-covered corner and carefully pulled back the growth, revealing a small brass plaque, "Catherine's Symphony, where music blooms." His fingers traced the letters as memories washed over him, and for the first time in years they didn't bring only pain. The garden looked different in the morning light, less haunting and more like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Emma had changed into old jeans and a t-shirt, her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail. She found Alexander waiting by the dried-up fountain, a stack of ancient garden tools at his feet. "These were your grandmother's," he said, handing her a pair of pruning shears that, despite their age, still looked sharp and well-made. She always said the right tools make all the difference. Together, they began clearing a path through the overgrown garden, following the map in Thomas's journal. Emma noticed how her grandfather's movements, though stiff at first, became more fluid as they worked. His expertise showed in the way he handled the plants, even in their wild state. "The rose should be here," Alexander said, stopping near an old oak tree. Catherine planted it where it would get morning sun but afternoon shade. She said it made the colors more intense. They worked in companionable silence, carefully clearing away years of overgrowth. As they dug deeper into the tangles of vegetation, Emma's hand brushed against something solid buried in the soil. "Grandfather," she called out, excitement in her voice, "there's something here." Alexander knelt beside her, his knees protesting but his curiosity piqued. Together, they carefully excavated what appeared to be a small metal box, its surface corroded but intact. Emma's hands trembled as she wiped away the dirt, revealing an intricate musical note engraved on the lid. "I've never seen this before," Alexander said, his voice tight with surprise. Catherine never mentioned. Emma tried to open it, but years of exposure had sealed it shut. Alexander took it from her hands and examined it closely. "We'll need to clean this properly. There might be important papers inside. The humidity could damage them if we're not careful." As they continued their search for the rose, Emma's mind raced with possibilities about the box's contents. But before she could ask more questions, a flash of color caught her eye. There, partially hidden beneath a mass of common weeds, was a stem with distinctive thorns. "Grandfather, look!" Alexander's breath caught as he carefully parted the weeds. The plant was struggling, but alive, a single bud preparing to bloom, its tightly closed petals promising the unique purple-to-white gradation that had made it famous. "Impossible," he whispered, but there it was, Catherine's twilight surviving against all odds. "We need to clear the area around it," Emma said, already reaching for the tools. "Give it room to breathe. Dad's journal says it needs specific care to thrive." As they worked to save the rose, a car's engine sound interrupted the peaceful morning. Through the overgrown hedges, they could see a sleek black vehicle pulling up to the mansion's front entrance. Alexander's expression darkened. "That would be Victoria Blackwood," he said, his voice cold. "My late wife's sister. She's been trying to convince me to sell the property for years." Emma watched as an elegant woman in her 60s emerged from the car, her designer outfit a stark contrast to the wild garden surrounding them. Victoria's sharp eyes scanned the property with obvious disapproval before she noticed them working among the plants. "Alexander!" she called out, her voice carrying across the garden. "What on earth are you doing out there? And who is—" She stopped abruptly as she got a closer look at Emma, her perfectly maintained composure cracking for just a moment. "She looks just like Catherine," Victoria whispered, but quickly recovered her stern expression. "Alexander, we need to discuss the developer's latest offer. It's very generous, and frankly, maintaining this place is a drain on your resources." Emma felt her grandfather tense beside her. She noticed how his hand tightened around the garden tools, how his jaw clenched at Victoria's words. "The garden is not for sale, Victoria," he said firmly. "Now or ever." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she looked at Emma again. "And this child? Don't tell me you're actually believing." "Alexander, you're being ridiculous. After everything that happened with Thomas and that woman, surely you're not going to let yourself be manipulated again." Emma stepped forward, dirt smudging her cheek and determination in her eyes. "We found it, you know. Grandmother's special rose, and a box full of secrets too. This garden isn't just land to be sold, it's our family's heart." Victoria's expression flickered between shock and calculation. "A box? What box?" But Alexander was already stepping between them, his stance protective. "Thank you for your concern, Victoria, but as I said, the property is not for sale. Emma and I have work to do." "This isn't over, Alexander," Victoria warned, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold. "That girl shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly, you're playing happy families in the dirt? I'm concerned about your judgment. The board members will be too." As Victoria's car disappeared down the driveway, Emma looked up at her grandfather. "The board members?" Alexander sighed, suddenly looking tired. "Montgomery Enterprises. Victoria holds a significant number of shares. and she's been trying to gain control for years. But don't worry about that now, we have more important things to focus on. They returned to their work, but Emma could feel the tension lingering in the air. As they carefully cleaned the mysterious box, she noticed her grandfather glancing frequently at the driveway, as if expecting more unwelcome visitors. "Why does she want to sell the garden so badly?" Emma asked, working on a particularly stubborn patch of rust on the box. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands gentle as he tended to the recovered rose. "Because, my dear, some people can only see the value of things in terms of money. They've forgotten that the most precious treasures are the ones that can't be bought or sold." As if in response to his words, a petal unfurled on the rescued rose, revealing the first hint of its magnificent purple hue. And in that moment, Emma understood that she had stumbled into something much bigger than a family reunion. She had become part of a battle for the very soul of Blackwood Manor. After carefully cleaning the mysterious box in Alexander's study, Emma sat at the massive oak desk, holding her breath as her grandfather delicately worked on the corroded lock. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like golden spirits. "Got it," Alexander murmured as the lock finally gave way with a soft click. They exchanged a look of anticipation before he slowly lifted the lid. Inside, protected by a layer of waxed paper, lay a collection of items that made Alexander's hands tremble. Sheets of musical composition paper, letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them all a small leather-bound diary with Catherine's initials embossed in gold. "Your grandmother's private journal," Alexander whispered, lifting it with reverence. "I never knew she kept one." As they carefully removed each item, Emma noticed something else, a stack of unopened letters addressed to her father, all marked "Return to Sender" in Alexander's bold handwriting. Her grandfather's face tightened when he saw them, pain flickering across his features. "I wrote to him every month for a year after he left," Alexander admitted quietly. "He never replied. Now I know why. He never received them." Emma reached for the first letter, but Alexander stayed her hand. "Not yet. Some wounds need time before they can be reopened." Instead, they turned their attention to Catherine's journal. As Alexander read the first page, his voice caught. "Listen to this. The garden is more than earth and flowers. It's a symphony waiting to be discovered. Each bloom has its own note, each leaf its own rhythm. I've started composing again, inspired by the sounds of our sanctuary. Alexander doesn't know yet, but I'm writing a piece that will bring together everything we love: music, flowers, family. I call it the Garden Symphony." Emma's eyes widened. "Dad used to hum a melody he said reminded him of home. He could never remember where he learned it, but it made him feel peaceful. Could it have been—" Before she could finish her thought, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the door, her face unusually pale. "Mr. Montgomery, I apologize for interrupting, but Miss Victoria has returned. She's not alone." Alexander straightened, his expression hardening. "Who's with her?" "Mr. James Sullivan from the Board of Directors, sir. And—" Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "Two gentlemen from the Historical Society. They're claiming the mansion may be improperly maintained and are demanding an inspection." Emma watched her, grandfather's jaw clench. "Victoria moves quickly," he muttered. "Emma, take these things to your room and keep them safe. I'll handle this." But Emma stood her ground. "No," she said firmly. "This is my home too now. Let me help." Alexander studied her for a moment, seeing Catherine's determination in her stance. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, but first—" He reached into his desk drawer and removed a keyring. "The music room, third key from the left. Take your grandmother's journal there. I think you'll find something interesting on the piano." Emma hurried through the mansion's corridors, the precious journal clutched to her chest. She could hear voices echoing from the foyer. Victoria's. Cultured tones carrying an edge of triumph. Male voices she didn't recognize, asking about structural integrity and historical preservation. The music room key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside, sheets draped the furniture like ghosts. But Emma's attention was immediately drawn to the grand piano dominating the center of the room. Removing the cover, she gasped. The piano's surface was inlaid with the same musical note design as the garden box. Following her instinct, Emma opened Catherine's journal to its final pages. There, in careful notation, was sheet music titled "The Garden Symphony for My Family." But something was odd about the composition. Between the standard musical notes were symbols Emma had never seen before, delicate drawings of flowers. That seemed to be part of the music itself. "It's a code," she whispered to herself, excitement building. Her father had taught her about musical cryptography, how composers throughout history had hidden messages in their music. Could her grandmother have done the same? A commotion from downstairs interrupted her thoughts. She could hear Victoria's voice rising in apparent victory. "The Historical Society agrees, Alexander. This property requires resources you simply don't have anymore. As your family, we only want what's best." Emma's fingers found the piano keys, and before she could second-guess herself, she began to play the first lines of Catherine's composition. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, flowing through the mansion like water. As she played, she noticed something extraordinary. The flower symbols in the music corresponded perfectly to the garden's original layout in her father's journal. The voices downstairs fell silent. Then footsteps, multiple sets, hurrying toward the music room. Emma continued playing, her heart pounding but her fingers steady. The door opened, revealing Alexander, Victoria, and the visitors, all wearing expressions of varying degrees of shock. "Impossible," Victoria breathed. "That piece, Catherine never finished it. She said it would only be complete when the garden bloomed again." One of the men from the Historical Society stepped forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Mr. Montgomery, you never mentioned the house had such significant musical history. This changes everything. If this is indeed Catherine Montgomery's lost composition..." Emma turned on the piano bench to face them, still playing with one hand. "It's not lost," she said clearly. "It's exactly where it should be, waiting for the garden to bloom again. Just like I am. Just like we all are." She saw something shift in her grandfather's expression, pride, determination, and perhaps a touch of his old fire. Victoria must have seen it too, because her triumphant smile faded slightly. "The inspection can wait," Alexander declared, his voice carrying the authority of years of boardroom battles. "My granddaughter and I have a garden to restore, and a symphony to complete." The following days brought a flurry of activity to Blackwood Manor. The Historical Society's interest in Catherine's musical legacy had temporarily stayed Victoria's hand, but Emma could sense her great-aunt hadn't given up. She watched from her bedroom window as Victoria's sleek car made daily appearances, always accompanied by different important-looking visitors. "She's gathering allies," Alexander explained one morning as they worked in the garden. "Victoria never fights a battle she hasn't already won in her mind." They had made progress with Catherine's twilight rose, carefully pruning away the dead growth and nurturing the surviving stems. 2 more buds had appeared, promising future blooms. But it was the mystery of Catherine's composition that consumed Emma's thoughts. "The flower symbols in the music," she said, showing her grandfather the journal as they took a water break. "They're not just decoration. Look, each one appears at specific points in the melody, and they match exactly with locations in Dad's garden map." Alexander studied the pages with growing excitement. Catherine always said music and gardens were one and the same. Both needed structure and freedom, discipline and wildness. But this, he traced the symbols with a weathered finger. "This is something else entirely." A shadow fell across the journal, making them both look up. Mrs. Henderson stood there, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Montgomery, there's someone here you need to see." Following Mrs. Henderson into the study, they found a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair waiting for them. He turned as they entered, and Emma felt her grandfather stiffen beside her. "Hello, Father," the man said quietly. "It's been a long time." Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus." Emma looked between them, confusion evident on her face. Marcus, her father had mentioned that name once, she realized, an uncle she'd never known about. "I saw the Historical Society's announcement." "About Catherine's lost symphony," Marcus explained, his eyes falling on Emma. "And then I heard rumors about Thomas's daughter being here." He smiled gently. "You have his eyes. Why are you here, Marcus?" Alexander's tone was guarded, But Emma noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "Because it's time for the truth, Father. About everything. About why Thomas really left. About the real reason Victoria wants this place sold so badly." Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the garden, and about what really happened to Mother's music all those years ago. Emma watched her grandfather sink into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Marcus, please." "But," Marcus continued, his voice firm but kind, "Emma needs to know, we all do. Victoria didn't just drive Thomas away because he wanted to marry beneath our social circle. She did it because she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen when the truth about Catherine's last composition came out." Emma's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The flower symbols in the music. They're not just marking locations in the garden. They're marking something else, aren't they? Marcus nodded, impressed. Mother was clever. She knew Victoria was trying to gain control of the family company even then. So she hid the evidence of Victoria's earliest attempts to seize power, in the only place she knew it would be safe, in plain sight, written into the very music of the garden itself. "But how?" Emma asked, pulling out Catherine's journal. "I've been playing the piece, but not all of it," Marcus said. "The complete composition can only be played when the garden is in full bloom. Mother designed it that way. Each flower, each location, corresponds to a specific note or chord. The garden itself is the key to unlocking the full symphony." Alexander stood abruptly. "If what you're saying is true, all these years Victoria's attempts to buy the property weren't about development at all," Marcus finished. "They were about making sure certain truths stayed buried. But she didn't count on Thomas keeping such detailed records of the garden, or on his daughter inheriting both Catherine's musical talent and her determination." Emma's fingers tightened around the journal. "That's why the garden has to bloom again. Not just for the music, but for the truth." A knock at the study door interrupted them. Mrs. Henderson entered, looking flustered. "I'm sorry, sir, but Miss Victoria is here again, with the police this time. She's claiming there are unauthorized residents on the property." Marcus straightened, a flash of his father's authority crossing his face. "Let me handle Victoria. It's time someone stood up to her properly." He turned to Emma. "Keep working on the garden and the music. Everything depends on it now." As Marcus strode out to confront Victoria, Emma looked up at her grandfather. "Did you know about any of this?" Alexander shook his head slowly. "I knew Victoria was capable of manipulation, but this, I was too lost in my own grief to see what was happening right in front of me. After your grandmother became ill, and then Thomas left, I stopped paying attention to anything but my own pain." Emma took his hand, feeling the years of regret in his grip. "It's not too late, grandfather. The garden is coming back to life. The truth is finally coming out, and we're all here together. That's what really matters." Through the window, they could hear Victoria's voice rising in anger, met by Marcus's calm but firm responses. But Emma's attention was drawn to something else. A single perfect bloom had opened on Catherine's twilight rose, its petals fading, from deep purple to pure white, just as her father had described. And in that moment, she could have sworn she heard the faintest whisper of music in the garden breeze, calling them all home. The confrontation with Victoria had left the mansion in a state of uneasy calm. While Marcus handled the legal intricacies of Emma's residency, she and Alexander focused on their twin missions, restoring the garden and decoding Catherine's musical mystery. Emma sat at the grand piano, Catherine's journal open before her, while Alexander and Mrs. Henderson worked to uncover the old garden paths according to the coded map. The morning sun streamed through the music room's tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air with each note she played. "The sequence changes here," Emma muttered, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Every time there's a rose symbol, the melody shifts to a minor key, but when the jasmine appears..." She played the corresponding notes, and something clicked in her mind. "Grandfather, I need to show you something." She rushed to the garden, the journal clutched to her chest. Alexander was kneeling beside a newly uncovered section of the path, his usually immaculate clothes smudged with dirt. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, holding a stack of old photographs she'd found in the attic. images of the garden in its prime. "Look at this," Emma said excitedly, spreading the journal on a nearby garden table. The musical phrases with rose symbols all point to locations where Mom hid important documents. But the jasmine passages, they're different. They're like a separate melody intertwined with the main piece. Alexander studied the notation, his expression thoughtful. Catherine always said jasmine was nature's night guard. It blooms in darkness, protecting the garden's secrets. Exactly. Emma pointed to specific measures in the composition. These jasmine sections create a completely different song when played alone. I think they're leading to something else, something separate from Victoria's schemes. Their discussion was interrupted by Marcus's arrival. He looked tired but satisfied. "The police have left," he announced. "Victoria's claims about unauthorized residency won't hold up, especially now that I've filed the proper guardianship paperwork. Emma is legally allowed to stay." The relief on Alexander's face was visible, but Emma noticed something else in Marcus's expression, a hidden tension as if he was holding back crucial information. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "I've been doing some digging of my own. Victoria's not just after the property. She's after something specific. Something she thinks is hidden here." He pulled out an old newspaper, clipping from his briefcase. "Look at this." The yellowed paper showed a younger Catherine standing in the garden holding a violin. The headline read, "Montgomery heiress acquires lost Stradivarius, historic instrument to join family collection." "A Stradivarius?" Emma breathed. "Here?" "Mother was more than just a composer," Marcus explained. "She was also a collector of rare instruments. The Stradivarius disappeared after she became ill. Everyone assumed it was sold to pay for medical treatments, but..." He glanced at Alexander. "That's not what happened, is it, Father?" Alexander's face had gone pale. "Catherine wanted it protected. She said it would be needed when the garden bloomed again. I helped her hide it, but she never told me where. Said it was safer if only she knew. And she left the location in her music," Emma finished, understanding dawning. "The jasmine passages. They're not just a separate melody, they're a map to the violin." A sudden gust of wind rustled through the garden, carrying with it the sweet scent of the newly blooming Catherine's twilight rose. Emma turned to the sound of footsteps on gravel and saw Mrs. Henderson hurrying toward them, her face alight with excitement. "The night-blooming jasmine!" she exclaimed. "It's sprouting all along the east wall, exactly where the young miss has been playing that section of music every evening." Marcus's eyes widened. Of course, and the music isn't just a code, it's actually affecting the garden. The vibrations, the frequencies. Catherine designed her composition to encourage specific flowers to grow. Emma's fingers tingled with the memory of the notes. That's why it can only be fully played when the garden blooms, because playing it helps the garden bloom. It's a cycle, each supporting the other. Alexander stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Catherine always said music and nature spoke the same language. We just had to learn how to listen." He turned to Emma with newfound purpose. "Play it again. Play all of it. Every section you've decoded so far. Let's see what else awakens." As they made their way back to the music room, none of them noticed the small red light blinking from behind a nearby shrub. A surveillance camera recently installed, its lens focused on their every move. In her downtown office, Victoria watched the feed on her computer screen, her manicured nails tapping thoughtfully on her desk. "So," she murmured to herself, "the girl has figured it out. Time for a more direct approach." She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Mr. Chen." "Yes, it's time to move forward with our alternate plan. And remember, the violin must remain intact." Back at Blackwood Manor, Emma sat at the piano, her heart racing with anticipation. As her fingers touched the keys, beginning Catherine's complex composition, the evening sun caught the first jasmine buds beginning to unfurl along the east wall. The garden was awakening, note by note, flower by flower, revealing its secrets at last. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Blackwood Manor. Emma was practicing the jasmine passages when Mrs. Henderson appeared at the music room door, her expression uncertain. "Miss Emma? There's a gentleman here to see you. He says..." He's from the Chen family. Emma's hand stilled on the piano keys. Chen, like Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who took care of me. But the man who entered bore no resemblance to her elderly neighbor. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. "Miss Montgomery," he said smoothly. "I'm David Chen, Alice Chen's son. I've come about my mother's estate." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Estate? But Mrs. Chen is fine. I just spoke to her last week." "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," David said, his voice carrying practiced sympathy. "My mother has been in a nursing home for the past month. She's been quite confused, making phone calls to people she thinks she knows." He paused delicately. "The doctors say she's been imagining relationships that don't exist." Emma felt the room spin slightly. Mrs. Chen had been her anchor after her mother's hospitalization, her source of gardening knowledge, her connection to a normal life. The idea that it might all have been a confused elderly woman's imagination, "That's not possible," she said firmly, but doubt crept into her voice. "I have the documentation here," David said, reaching for his briefcase, "as well as some questions about certain items that have gone missing from my mother's home, including a very valuable antique violin. Step away from my granddaughter." Alexander stood in the doorway, Marcus at his side. Both men's expressions were thunderous. "Mr. Chen," Marcus said coldly, "or should I say, Mr. Chen Blackwood, Victoria's marriage to your father was brief, but it left quite a paper trail." David's smooth facade cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." "We've done our research," Marcus continued. "Mrs. Chen is perfectly fine. In fact, she just filed a police report about her son impersonating her lawyer and attempting to access her accounts." Emma felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by anger. "You're working with Victoria. All that stuff about Mrs. Chen being confused was a rather clumsy attempt at psychological manipulation," Alexander finished. "Victoria's getting desperate if these are the tactics she's resorting to." David's pleasant mask dissolved completely. "You have no idea what's really at stake." "Here," he snapped. "That violin isn't just a valuable instrument, it's proof. Proof that could destroy everything Victoria has built." "What do you mean, proof?" Emma demanded. But David was already backing toward the door. "You'll find out soon enough. Victoria sends her regards and a reminder that time is running out." After he left, Emma turned to her grandfather and uncle. What did he mean about the violin? Being proof? Proof of what? Marcus and Alexander exchanged heavy looks. Finally, Marcus spoke. "The Stradivarius wasn't just any violin. It belonged to a Jewish musician who fled Europe during World War II. He entrusted it to our family for safekeeping, along with documentation about certain wealthy families who had collaborated with the enemy, including Victoria's late husband's family." "Victoria married into old money," Alexander added quietly. "Money with a very dark history. If that documentation ever came to light, she'd lose everything," Emma finished. "Her social standing, her business connections, and more importantly," Marcus said, "she'd have to face the truth about her own choices, about choosing wealth and power over justice." Emma returned to the piano, her fingers finding the jasmine melody that seemed to make the garden respond. That's why finding the violin is so important. It's not just about the music or the garden, it's about setting things right. As she played, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the garden. The jasmine buds were growing visibly now, reaching toward the light. But among them, something else caught Emma's eye, a glint of metal on the east wall, partially hidden by vines. "Look!" she exclaimed, rushing to the window. "There's something there!" They hurried outside, carefully pushing aside the growing jasmine vines. Embedded in the wall was a small brass plate, engraved with a musical staff. The notes matched exactly with the passage Emma had just been playing. "It's another clue," she breathed. "The jasmine isn't just growing randomly, it's growing in a pattern, following the music, and it's leading us somewhere." Alexander touched the brass plate reverently. "Catherine, you brilliant woman," he murmured. "You knew. Someone would try to rewrite history. So you wrote your own version into the garden itself." As if in response to his words, more jasmine buds began to unfurl, their sweet scent filling the air. The garden was coming alive, note by note, revealing its secrets at its own pace. But time was running out. Victoria's failed attempt at manipulation proved she was getting desperate. Emma returned to the piano with renewed determination. She had to decode the rest of the symphony before Victoria made her next move. As her fingers danced across the keys, the jasmine continued to bloom, its white flowers glowing like stars in the growing dusk. Somewhere in the garden, hidden by time and nature, Catherine's final truth waited to be discovered, a truth that could change everything. The discovery of the brass plate energized everyone at Blackwood Manor. Emma spent her mornings practicing the decoded sections of Catherine's symphony, while Alexander and Marcus worked tirelessly in the garden, following the pattern of the blooming jasmine. Mrs. Henderson, inspired by the renewed life in the house, began opening rooms that had been sealed for years. "Look what I found in the conservatory," she announced one morning, carrying a dusty violin case. "It's not the Stradivarius, but it's one of Catherine's practice violins, still in good condition too." Emma opened the case reverently. The instrument. Inside was beautiful, its wood gleaming with a deep, rich patina. "Can I try it?" she asked her grandfather. Alexander nodded, his eyes soft with memory. "Your father learned on that very violin. Catherine always said the instrument chooses its player." As Emma lifted the violin to her shoulder, muscle memory she didn't know she possessed took over. Her father had taught her piano, yes, but he'd also spent countless hours positioning her hands on a violin, teaching her proper bow technique. She'd almost forgotten those lessons buried under years of grief and change. The first notes were hesitant, but as she played the jasmine melody from Catherine's symphony, something extraordinary happened. The music seemed to float through the house and into the garden, and everywhere it touched, plants stirred as if awakening from a deep sleep. "Emma!" Marcus called from the garden. "You need to see this!" Still holding the violin, she hurried. Outside, the jasmine vines were moving, actually moving, reaching toward each other across the garden walls. As they grew, they revealed more brass plates, each engraved with a different musical phrase. "It's like a musical constellation," Emma breathed. "Each plate is a star and the jasmine vines are connecting them." Alexander studied the pattern with growing excitement. The plates form a perfect circle around the garden. And look, they're all positioned at specific heights and angles. Catherine wasn't just leaving us music, she was creating an acoustic map. But a map to what? Marcus wondered aloud. Emma's eyes followed the jasmine vines, noting how they seemed to be pointing toward something. "We need to play all the phrases, together, at the same time. That's why Catherine left her practice violin. We need both piano and violin to complete the symphony." They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Mrs. Henderson helped Emma move the piano closer to the garden doors, while Alexander and Marcus cleared paths between all the brass plates. The garden itself seemed to be helping, with vines shifting, to create clear sightlines between each musical marker. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Emma sat at the piano, the violin resting beside her. Alexander stood ready with Catherine's journal, prepared to help coordinate the complex musical sequence. Marcus positioned himself in the garden, watching for any changes the music might trigger. "Ready?" Emma asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. But before her fingers could touch the keys, a commotion erupted at the front of the mansion. Victoria's voice carried across the garden, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps. "This way, gentlemen. As you can see, the property has fallen into complete disrepair. As head of the Montgomery Foundation's Historical Committee, I have no choice but to recommend immediate intervention." Emma quickly gathered Catherine's journal and the violin, following Alexander and Marcus into the relative safety of the conservatory. Through the glass walls, they could see Victoria leading a group of official-looking men through the garden. "The Foundation's Board of Trustees," Marcus whispered. "She's making her move to have the property declared historically compromised. If they rule in her favor, they can force a sale for preservation purposes." "But look at their faces," Emma whispered back. "They're not seeing a ruined garden, they're seeing one that's coming back to life." Indeed, the trustees were looking around with obvious appreciation. The jasmine vines, The blooming Catherine's twilight roses, the cleared pathways. Everything spoke of renewal rather than decay. Victoria, noticing their reactions, quickly changed tactics. Of course, the recent improvements are purely cosmetic. The real issues lie in the historical integrity of the property. For instance, the disappearance of priceless artifacts like the Stradivarius violin, which was never part of the Foundation's holdings. Alexander's voice rang out as he stepped forward. The violin and its accompanying documentation were private property entrusted to my wife's care. Victoria's smile turned sharp. But as Catherine's nearest living relative after you, dear brother-in-law, surely I have some say in the disposition of her personal effects. Actually, Marcus produced a document from his briefcase. You don't. I took the liberty of reviewing Mother's will. The violin and all related materials were specifically left in trust for her grandchildren, which makes Emma the legal heir. The trustees murmured among themselves, clearly impressed by this legal clarity. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, her eyes darting around the garden as if searching for something. That's when Emma noticed a familiar face among Victoria's entourage, David Chen, attempting to blend into the background while studying the brass plates with obvious interest. As she watched, he slipped something small and electronic into a flower bed. Emma caught Marcus's eye and subtly gestured toward David. Marcus nodded, understanding. They needed to get back to the symphony before Victoria and her allies could interfere further. Whatever Catherine had hidden, whatever truth the violin would reveal, they had to find it first. The trustees began asking Alexander questions about the garden's restoration, drawing Victoria's attention. Emma used the distraction to quietly return to the piano, positioning her hands over the keys. The sun was reaching the perfect angle, illuminating all the brass plates simultaneously. It was time to let the garden's symphony play its final movement. As Victoria continued her tour with the trustees, Emma began to play. The melody started softly, almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Alexander quickly positioned himself to block the trustees' view of the piano, engaging them in animated conversation about the garden's historical significance. The jasmine melody flowed from Emma's fingers, and Marcus quietly retrieved Catherine's violin. Years of music lessons came rushing back as Emma seamlessly transitioned from piano to violin, letting the piano notes fade while the violin took up the melody. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The brass plates began to resonate with the music, each one catching and reflecting the sunlight in perfect synchronization with the notes. The jasmine vines swayed gently, despite the complete absence of wind. Victoria was the first to notice something was happening. She turned sharply at the sound of the violin, her face paling as she recognized the melody. "Stop that music immediately," she commanded, but her voice was drowned out by the swelling symphony. The trustees, far from being concerned, were entranced. One of them, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, stepped forward. "This is remarkable," he breathed. "I haven't heard this piece since Catherine performed it at the conservatory's centennial celebration, but it was never completed." Emma continued playing, moving between piano and violin as the complex composition required. The garden seemed to pulse with each note, the very air vibrating with music. The jasmine vines grew more rapidly now, weaving between the brass plates in an intricate dance. Suddenly, a beam of reflected sunlight from one of the plates caught another at precisely the right angle, creating a golden line of light. Then another plate caught the reflection, and another, until a perfect geometric pattern was drawn in, light across the garden. "The acoustic map," Marcus whispered excitedly. "It's not just about the music, it's about the light." David Chen made a move toward one of the plates, but Marcus smoothly intercepted him. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. "The police are already on their way to discuss your earlier impersonation charges." The trustees were watching in amazement as the pattern of light grew more complex. The elderly trustee, who had recognized the music, suddenly laughed in delight. "Of course. Catherine always said music was light you could hear and light was music you could see. She's created a symphony of both." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. They're trying to distract you from the real issues. That girl isn't even a true Montgomery. Her mother was a common music teacher who seduced Thomas away from his responsibilities. A music teacher, Emma said, never stopping her playing, who graduated top of her class from the same conservatory where grandmother Catherine studied, who taught underprivileged children to play violin using the same methods grandmother developed, who loved my father enough to support his dream of teaching music instead of joining the family business. The pattern of light had begun to concentrate on a single point, a seemingly solid section of the garden wall. As the music reached a crescendo, a previously invisible seam appeared in the stone, revealed by the precise alignment of light and shadow. Alexander stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the wall exactly where the light converged. With a soft click, a hidden panel swung open. Inside was a velvet-lined compartment containing a violin case, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Beside it lay a thick envelope, sealed with the Montgomery family crest. Victoria lunged forward, but the trustees quickly blocked her path. The elderly trustee spoke firmly. As representatives of the Montgomery Foundation, we are quite satisfied that Blackwood Manor is in excellent hands. Moreover, we are witnessing what appears to be a significant historical and artistic discovery. The Foundation would be very interested in supporting the complete restoration of both house and garden. As Alexander carefully lifted out the violin case, Emma completed the final phrases of the symphony. The garden seemed to sigh with satisfaction, the jasmine vines settling into their new growth patterns, their white flowers glowing in the afternoon sun. The garden was the key all along, Emma said softly, lowering the practice violin. But not just the garden. It was the harmony between music and nature, between light and sound, just like the harmony between all of us. Victoria stood rigid, watching as Alexander opened the envelope. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice desperate. "Some truth should stay buried." "No, Victoria," Alexander replied, his voice firm but sad. "We've all stayed buried too long, in grief, in fear, in shame. It's time for everything to come into the light." As he began to read the contents of the envelope, Emma noticed something else in the hidden compartment, a smaller envelope addressed specifically to her in Catherine's elegant handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing the final measures of the Garden Symphony, never before seen or played. The trustees gathered around Alexander, their expressions growing more serious as they read the documents. Victoria backed away slowly, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. David Chen had already disappeared, presumably to avoid the arriving police. But Emma's attention was focused entirely on the last piece of her grandmother's symphony. She lifted the violin once more, ready to play the final notes that would complete the garden's awakening, and with it, her family's healing. The days following the discovery of the Stradivarius brought dramatic changes to Blackwood Manor. The police had come and gone, taking statements about David Chen's deceptions. Victoria had retreated to her downtown office, her power over the family diminished but not entirely broken. The trustees had pledged their full support to the garden's restoration. Fascinated by Catherine's musical innovation, Emma sat in the conservatory, carefully cleaning the Stradivarius under Alexander's watchful eye. The instrument was even more beautiful than she had imagined, its wood glowing with centuries of history and music. "Your grandmother would be proud," Alexander said softly, "not just of finding the violin, but of how you've brought music back to this house." Before Emma could respond, Marcus burst into the conservatory, waving a newspaper. "You need to see this," he said, spreading the paper on a nearby table. The headline read, "Historic Discovery at Blackwood Manor. Montgomery Heiress Uncovers Lost Musical Innovation." Emma scanned the article, her eyes widening. They're calling grandmother's musical garden system a breakthrough in botanical science. Listen to this. Catherine Montgomery's unprecedented combination of musical frequencies and horticultural techniques could revolutionize plant growth and garden design. The university wants to study the system, Marcus added. They're particularly interested in how the music affects plant growth patterns, and the Conservatory of Music is requesting permission to archive Catherine's compositions. Alexander smiled, but his eyes were distant. Catherine always said her music would change the world. I just never understood how literally she meant it. Emma carefully set the Stradivarius in its case and moved to the piano. The final measures of the symphony, found in Catherine's personal note to her, still waited to be played. But something held her back, a feeling that the timing wasn't quite right. "The documents that were with the violin," she said instead. "What did they reveal?" Alexander and Marcus exchanged glances. Finally, Marcus spoke. "They proved that Victoria's late husband's family had acquired their fortune through morally questionable means during the war. The violin was entrusted to our family specifically because Catherine promised to protect both the instrument and the truth about its journey. Victoria's marriage into that family wasn't a love match," Alexander added quietly. "She knew about their past but chose to overlook it in exchange for social position and wealth. When she discovered Catherine had evidence that could expose everything, she tried to gain control of the property to keep it hidden," Emma finished. "But why didn't grandmother expose the truth immediately?" "Because of you," a new voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Mrs. Henderson carrying a stack of old letters. "I found these while cleaning Catherine's writing desk. They're from your mother, Emma." Emma took the letters with trembling hands. They were dated from before she was born, when her parents had first fallen in love. As she read, tears filled her eyes. "Catherine knew," she whispered. "She knew Victoria would do anything to keep her secrets hidden, including hurting our family. So she hid the evidence and created this elaborate system to protect it until the right time, until someone came who could understand both the music and the garden." Alexander moved to the window, looking out at the flourishing garden. The jasmine vines had continued to grow, creating a natural canopy over the paths. Catherine's twilight roses were blooming in abundance, their unique colors drawing admiring visitors daily. "The garden was never just about plants or music," he said thoughtfully. "It was about truth taking root, growing in its own time." Catherine understood that some things can't be forced. They have to grow naturally, like her roses. Emma returned to the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. The final measures of the symphony seemed to call to her, but as she studied them more closely, she noticed something unusual about the notation. "This isn't just a conclusion," she said excitedly. "It's written as a round, a piece that can be played in harmony with the beginning. The symphony doesn't end. It cycles back to create something entirely new." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, examining the music. "Look at the flower symbols, too. They match perfectly with the new growth patterns in the garden. The plants are literally growing in harmony with each other." "Catherine's final gift," Alexander murmured, "not just exposing the truth, but showing us how to create something beautiful from it." As if in response to his words, a shaft of sunlight broke through the conservatory windows, catching the crystal chandelier and sending rainbow patterns dancing across the room. The light touched the Stradivarius in its case, making the wood seem to glow from within. Emma felt a surge of understanding. The final measures weren't meant to be played alone. They were meant to be played as part of a greater whole, bringing together all the elements of Catherine's vision: the garden, the music, the light, and most importantly, the family. She turned to her grandfather and uncle, her eyes shining with purpose. "I know what we need to do," she said. "We need to organize a proper concert here in the garden, not just to play the symphony, but to show the world what grandmother Catherine created, a place where truth and beauty grow together, where music and nature speak the same language." Alexander's face softened with pride and love. "Your grandmother once told me that every garden needs 3 things to thrive: sunlight, water, and love. With you here, Emma, we finally have all 3 again." As they began to plan the concert, none of them noticed a small figure standing in the garden, Victoria, watching through the conservatory windows, her expression a complex mixture of regret and resignation. In her hand, she held an old photograph of herself and Catherine as young girls, playing music together in this very garden, before ambition and fear had poisoned their relationship. The truth had finally bloomed, just as Catherine had planned, and with it came the possibility not just of justice, but of redemption. Preparations for the garden concert consumed Blackwood Manor for the next 2 weeks. The Historical Society. helped restore the garden's original pathways, while botanical experts marveled at Catherine's innovative system of musical plant cultivation. News of the upcoming event spread quickly, drawing interest from musicians, scientists, and historians alike. Emma spent every morning practicing with the Stradivarius, which responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for her all along. The violin's tone was extraordinary, warm and rich, with a depth that seemed to reach into the soul. When she played Catherine's symphony, the garden itself appeared to listen. "The acoustics are perfect," Marcus observed one morning as he helped set up chairs for the concert. "The way Catherine designed the garden, every path, every wall, it's like a natural amphitheater." Mrs. Henderson, who had taken charge of the event's logistics, nodded in agreement. "Even the flower beds are arranged to enhance the sound." "Your grandmother thought of everything, dear." Alexander had been quieter than usual, spending long hours in his study, reviewing old papers and photographs. Emma found him there one afternoon, surrounded by memories. "I found this," he said, holding out a faded photograph. It was taken the day Catherine first played the Stradivarius in the garden. The image showed a younger Catherine, radiant with joy, playing the violin while surrounded by blooming roses. Beside her stood a younger Alexander, looking at his wife with undisguised adoration. In the background, a teenage Thomas could be seen practicing his own violin. "She knew, even then, that music could heal," Alexander said softly. "Not just plants, but people too. I'd forgotten that after everything changed." Emma sat beside him, studying the photograph. "It's not too late," she said gently. "The garden is blooming again. The music is back. And look," she pointed to the window, where they could see Victoria walking slowly through the garden, her usual confident stride replaced by something more contemplative. Victoria had been making daily visits to the garden, though she rarely spoke to anyone. She would stand for hours near Catherine's twilight roses, or sit listening when Emma practiced the symphony. The transformation in her was subtle but undeniable. As the day of the concert approached, Emma made a decision. She took Catherine's final musical passage and began to compose a companion piece, a harmony that would weave through the original, melody like the jasmine vines through the garden. "What are you working on?" Marcus asked, finding her surrounded by sheet music in the conservatory. "Grandmother's symphony tells the story of truth, hidden and finally revealed," Emma explained. "But I think it needs something more. A song of forgiveness, of new beginnings." The morning of the concert dawned clear and bright. The garden had outdone itself, with every flower in full bloom. The jasmine vines created natural archways over the seating areas, and Catherine's twilight roses perfumed the air with their unique fragrance. As guests began to arrive, Emma noticed Victoria standing hesitantly at the garden's entrance. Making a quick decision, she walked over to her great-aunt, holding out an envelope. "These were with the violin," Emma said quietly. "Letters between you and grandmother from before everything. She never gave up hope that you would find your way back to the person you used to be." Victoria's hands trembled as she took the envelope. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of losing everything I'd built. I never realized how much I'd already lost by keeping those secrets." "It's not too late," Emma echoed her earlier words to Alexander. "The garden knows about second chances, so did grandmother." The concert began as the afternoon sun reached the perfect angle to illuminate all of Catherine's brass plates. Emma started with the original symphony, letting the familiar melodies flow through the garden. The jasmine swayed, the roses seemed to glow, and the audience sat entranced as music and nature danced together. Then, at the moment when Catherine's final passage would have begun, Emma seamlessly transitioned into her new composition. The harmony she had written soared above the original melody, not hiding it, but enhancing it, transforming it into something new yet familiar. She saw Alexander's eyes fill with tears as he recognized phrases from Catherine's love songs woven into the music. She watched Marcus smile as he caught echoes of Thomas's childhood practice pieces. And she saw Victoria, sitting straight-backed in her chair, close her eyes as the music carried her back to summer afternoons, spent playing duets with her sister in this very garden. As the final notes faded into the evening air, the garden itself seemed to exhale. The jasmine flowers released their sweetest perfume, and Catherine's twilight roses turned their faces to catch the last rays of sun, their petals shifting from deep purple to pure white, in perfect synchronization with the music's end. The applause was thunderous, but Emma barely heard it. Her attention was caught by something extraordinary. A new rosebud, growing and blooming, impossibly fast in the fading light. Its petals were unlike anything she had seen before, silver white with edges that seemed to shimmer with rainbow hues, like music made visible. Mrs. Henderson gasped. It's exactly like the one in Catherine's last diary entry. She wrote about dreaming of a rose that would bloom only when the garden's voice was complete again. Alexander moved to stand beside Emma, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She called it Harmony's Dawn, he said softly. And she predicted it would only appear when the garden's true purpose was fulfilled, not just growing flowers or making music, but bringing people together, helping truth and love bloom again. As twilight settled over Blackwood Manor, the garden hummed with new life and old memories reconciled. The path ahead was clear now, lit by the legacy of a woman who had understood that the most beautiful symphonies are those played by many hearts in harmony. The success of the garden concert transformed Blackwood Manor overnight. Requests poured in from universities wanting to study Catherine's musical gardening system, and the Conservatory of Music proposed establishing a scholarship in her name. But the most significant changes were happening within the family itself. One morning, as Emma practiced with the Stradivarius, she heard unfamiliar voices in the garden. Looking out the music room window, she saw Victoria leading a small group of elderly people through the paths. "These roses," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly, "were created by my sister Catherine. She understood that beauty could emerge from the darkest places." She paused beside a particularly vibrant bloom. "Like these people you see before you, survivors and descendants of those who entrusted their stories to our family. Stories that I helped keep hidden for far too long." Emma set down the violin and moved closer to the window. The visitors were touching the flowers with reverence, some wiping tears from their eyes. Victoria's face showed a vulnerability Emma had never seen before. "The Montgomery Foundation," Victoria continued, "will be establishing a trust to restore art and musical instruments lost during the war. It's time these treasures, like this garden, were brought back into the light." Alexander appeared beside Emma at the window. "Victoria came to me yesterday," he said quietly. "She's been meeting with ethics committees, historical societies working to make amends. The garden's awakening seems to have awakened something in her as well." Emma thought about her new composition, the harmony she had written to complement Catherine's symphony. Maybe that's what grandmother meant about the garden's true purpose. It's not just about growing flowers or making music. It's about helping truth and healing grow together. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus rushing into the room, his face alight with excitement. "Emma, the conservatory wants you to perform Catherine's symphony at their centennial celebration. And there's more. They're interested in your companion piece. They think the two works together could be the centerpiece of a new musical education program." Emma's heart leaped, but then reality crashed in. "But what about Mom? Her treatments? I can't leave her." "Actually," Marcus smiled, "I've been meaning to tell you, the Foundation's new medical initiative, the one Victoria proposed, it includes funding for innovative treatments. Your mother has been accepted into a promising new program." Tears sprang to Emma's eyes. Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Catherine always said talent runs in families," he said softly. "She would be so proud to see you carrying on her legacy of healing through music." The garden seemed to respond to their emotions. The new rose variety, Harmony's Dawn, had begun propagating itself throughout the garden, its rainbow-edged petals catching the light like prisms. Each bloom seemed to create its own subtle melody when the wind blew through its petals. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself alone in the conservatory, practicing her new composition. The piece had evolved since the concert, incorporating elements she had discovered in Catherine's later journal entries. musical phrases designed to encourage specific growth patterns in plants. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a tea tray and an intriguing announcement. "The university botanists have made the most remarkable discovery," she said, pouring tea into delicate cups. "Those electronic sensors they installed, they're picking up actual sound patterns from the plants themselves, tiny vibrations that change based on the music being played. The garden really does have its own voice," Emma mused, accepting a cup of tea. "Indeed it does," Mrs. Henderson smiled. "And speaking of voices, you have a visitor waiting in the garden, someone quite special." Curious, Emma made her way outside. There, standing beside Catherine's twilight roses, was her mother. Julia Montgomery looked thin but radiant, her smile as bright as ever. "Mom!" Emma ran to embrace her. "But the hospital? How?" "The new treatment is working better than anyone expected," Julia said, holding her daughter tight. "And when Victoria told me about the conservatory's offer, well, I couldn't miss seeing my daughter follow in her grandmother's footsteps." They walked through the garden together, Julia marveling at the changes. When they reached the newly blooming Harmony's Dawn roses, she stopped, touching the iridescent petals gently. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly. "He always said you had Catherine's gift, the ability to see the music in everything." Emma showed her mother the violin, watching as Julia ran her fingers reverently over the ancient wood. "It's not just Catherine's gift," Emma said. "It's all of us, you, Dad, Grandfather, even Victoria. The garden brought us all back together, just like Grandmother planned." As if in response to her words, a soft breeze stirred the garden, carrying the mingled fragrances of jasmine and roses. The brass plates caught the afternoon sun, sending sparkles of light dancing across the paths like musical notes come to life. In that moment, surrounded by the garden's symphony of light, scent, and sound, Emma understood that this was just the beginning. Catherine's legacy would continue to grow and evolve, bringing healing and harmony to new generations, just as the garden itself renewed with each passing season. The days leading up to Emma's departure for the conservatory were filled with both excitement and peaceful moments of connection. The garden had become a gathering place not just for the family, but for people seeking healing and hope. Victoria's initiative to return lost musical instruments to their rightful families had brought visitors from around the world, each carrying stories that found their echo in the garden's harmonies. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple reminiscent of Catherine's roses, Alexander called a family meeting in the conservatory. The space had been transformed, its glass walls now gleaming, its plants thriving under the influence of Emma's daily practice sessions. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Alexander began, looking around at the faces of his gathered family, Emma, Julia, Marcus, Victoria, and Mrs. Henderson, who had long since become more than just a housekeeper. About the future of Blackwood Manor, Emma felt her heart skip. Despite all the positive changes, part of her had been worried about leaving the garden, about what might happen to this magical place that had brought her family back together. "The universities want to establish a research center here," Alexander continued, "to study Catherine's methods of musical plant cultivation. The conservatory wants to create a school of musical ecology, and Victoria's foundation needs a headquarters for its restoration work." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "So I propose we give them all what they want, by turning Blackwood Manor into something entirely new, the Catherine Montgomery Institute for Musical and Botanical Arts." The conservatory erupted in excited conversation. Julia clasped her, hands together, tears in her eyes. "A place where music and nature can heal together, just like they helped heal our family." "The garden will be at the heart of it," Marcus added enthusiastically. "We can build glass-walled practice rooms among the flowers, design new experimental growing spaces, and establish a proper archive," Victoria interjected, her business acumen now turned to positive purposes. "A place to preserve not just Catherine's work, but all the stories and histories we're uncovering through the Instrument Restoration Project." Emma listened to their plans with growing excitement, but something was tugging at her mind. She turned to her grandfather. "The Harmony's Dawn roses, they're still spreading through the garden, still creating new variations. What if they're not finished teaching us?" Alexander finished her thought. Exactly. Which is why the Institute will need a resident musical botanist, someone who understands both the science and the soul of what Catherine created. Emma felt her mother's hand slip into hers. Your grandmother knew that some gifts skip a generation, Julia said softly. She told me, once before you were born, that she was creating all this for someone who would come later, someone who would understand. And until you finish your studies at the conservatory, Alexander added. Marcus has agreed to oversee the Institute's development. Mrs. Henderson will manage the house as she always has, and your mother will help establish the music therapy program she's been designing during her recovery. Victoria stood, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. The Harmony's dawn roses glowed in the twilight, their rainbow edges catching the last rays of sun. I've learned that it's never too late to change your path, she said quietly. Catherine knew that too. This institute, it's not just about preserving the past, it's about growing toward the light, no matter how long you've been in shadow. As if responding to her words, the garden's evening symphony began. The subtle harmonies of leaves moving in the breeze, the gentle resonance of the brass plates, and the almost imperceptible singing of the roses themselves. Emma had learned to hear these sounds over the past weeks, to understand how they wove together into something greater than their parts. Before you leave for the conservatory, Alexander said, there's one more thing. He handed Emma an envelope, addressed in Catherine's handwriting, for my granddaughter when the garden blooms again. Inside, Emma found a single sheet of paper. Not music this time, but a letter. My dearest girl, you've brought the garden back to life, just as I hoped you would. But this is only the beginning. The true symphony is the one we create together. Family, friends, even those we once thought lost to us. The garden will always be here for you, growing new harmonies, teaching new songs. Remember, music, like love, only grows stronger when it's shared. With all my love, Grandmother Catherine. As Emma read the letter aloud, the evening light seemed to gather around them, warm and golden. Through the conservatory's glass walls, they could see the garden glowing with its own inner light, the harmonies. Dawn roses releasing soft sparkles of rainbow luminescence into the gathering dusk. The family sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the garden's evening song. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new songs to learn, new harmonies to discover. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be. Together in the garden where love had finally bloomed again. As autumn approached, Blackwood Manor hummed with activity. Architects and designers moved through the house, working to transform the space while preserving its historic character. The garden continued to thrive with the Harmony's dawn roses, creating new variations almost daily, each one more extraordinary than the last. Emma spent her mornings practicing for her upcoming conservatory debut, the Stradivarius, responding to her touch with increasing warmth and depth. Her mother, Julia, growing stronger each day, had begun teaching small music therapy sessions in the conservatory, her students responding remarkably to the combination of music and Catherine's botanical innovations. "Watch this," Julia said one morning as Emma took a break from practice. She played a simple melody on a small keyboard, and the nearby Harmony's dawn roses swayed in response, their rainbow-edged petals shimmering with subtle lights. "The university researchers are fascinated," Marcus added, entering with a stack of blueprints. "They've detected specific growth responses to different musical frequencies. Catherine's system is proving to be far more sophisticated than anyone imagined." Alexander joined them, examining the blueprints for the institute. The plans showed new glass-walled practice rooms integrated into the garden, research laboratories designed to blend seamlessly with the historic architecture, and a central performance space that would amplify the garden's natural acoustic properties. The historical. "Society has approved everything," he said proudly. "They agree that this is exactly the kind of innovation Catherine would have wanted, honoring the past while growing into the future." Victoria, who had been quietly arranging flowers nearby, spoke up. "The Foundation's board is unanimously supportive. The first group of restored instruments will be ready for return next month." She paused, touching a rose petal gently. "Some of the family's They've waited generations to reclaim these pieces of their heritage. Emma watched her great-aunt, marveling at the change in her. Victoria's sharp business attire had been replaced by more casual clothes suitable for garden work, and her once rigid posture had softened. She spent hours in the garden now, often sitting quietly among the flowers, as if making peace with her past. "Mrs. Henderson found something else in the attic," Emma said, retrieving a dusty violin case. "It's not valuable like the Stradivarius, but..." She opened the case to reveal a child's violin, its surface scratched but still beautiful. Victoria's breath caught. "Catherine's first violin," she whispered. "The one we shared as girls, before everything changed." Alexander moved to stand beside his sister-in-law. "Perhaps," he said gently, "it's time for it to be played again. The Institute will need instruments for its students." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I haven't played in years. Not since you chose a different path," Julia finished softly. "But paths can cross again. The garden has taught us that." As if in response to their words, a shaft of sunlight broke through the conservatory windows, catching the brass plates in the garden and creating a cascade of rainbow lights. The Harmony's dawn roses turned their faces toward the illumination, and a new bud began to unfurl before their eyes. This bloom was different from all the others. Its petals were white with edges that seemed to contain every color at once, like light through a prism. As it opened, a subtle melody emerged, a harmony that complemented the garden's usual evening song. "It's the same melody," Victoria said in wonder, "the one Catherine and I used to play together as girls. How is that possible?" Emma lifted the Stradivarius to her shoulder. "The garden remembers," she said simply, and began to play the melody she heard in the Roses' song. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then picked up the old student violin. Slowly, tentatively at first, she joined in, the two instruments weaving together in a duet that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Julia moved to the keyboard, adding gentle chords that the Roses swayed to. Marcus and Alexander watched in amazement as new buds began forming on the Harmony's dawn bushes, each one containing its own unique rainbow pattern. Mrs. Henderson appeared, in the doorway, her face glowing with joy. "The contractors have finished the basic renovations," she announced. "And you'll never believe what they found behind one of the old walls. A whole collection of Catherine's original gardening journals, with detailed notes about her musical planting theories." The music swelled as the family gathered around the discovered journals. Each page revealed more of Catherine's vision, diagrams showing how different musical frequencies could affect plant growth, notes about the relationship between harmony and healing, and most importantly, her dreams for what the garden could become. "Listen to this," Alexander read aloud. "Music and nature speak the same language, the language of growth, of healing, of endless possibility. All we need to do is create the space where they can speak together." Emma lowered her violin, looking out at the garden where workers were carefully marking out spaces for the new additions. "That's exactly what we're doing," she said softly. "Creating a space where everything can grow together. Music, plants, people, memories." Victoria set down her violin, her fingers trailing over its worn surface. "And second chances," she added quietly. "Catherine knew all along that the garden would bring us back to ourselves." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the conservatory, the family stood together, surrounded by the physical manifestations of Catherine's dreams. The blooming roses, the precious violins, the plans for the future, and most importantly, the renewed bonds between them all. The garden's evening symphony began, but now it contained new elements: the gentle harmonics of the Harmony's dawn roses, the whisper of autumn leaves, and the subtle resonance of possibilities yet to unfold. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges, more growth. But the foundations were set strong and true, rooted in love and nurtured by music. The week before Emma's departure for the conservatory brought an unexpected discovery. As workers cleared space for one of the new practice rooms, they uncovered a small underground chamber beneath the garden's central fountain. Inside, perfectly preserved, was Catherine's original workspace, a combination of botanical laboratory and music room. "Look at these instruments," Marcus marveled. carefully examining the delicate glass tubes and modified violins that lined the walls. She was measuring the exact frequencies that affected plant growth, creating a whole new science. Emma ran, her fingers over a particularly interesting device, a hybrid between a violin and a scientific instrument, with special sensors attached to the strings. She wasn't just playing music to the plants, she realized. She was listening to them. Playback. The discovery energized the entire project. University researchers arrived to document and study Catherine's equipment, while the conservatory sent experts to analyze her musical innovations. But it was the personal items found in the chamber that touched the family most deeply. A small journal, its pages still crisp, contained Catherine's final entries. "My dearest family, if you're reading this, then the garden has finally revealed all its secrets. The music you've discovered is more than just notes on a page. It's a bridge between worlds, between hearts, between past and future. The instruments I've created here are tools for understanding the universal language that connects all living things. But my greatest experiment was never about plants or music alone. It was about creating a space where truth could take root and grow, where harmony could heal old wounds, and where love could bloom again, even in the most unlikely places. The garden will continue to evolve, to create new songs, new colors, new possibilities. Trust in its wisdom, as I have trusted in the love that binds our family together, even when we couldn't see it." As Emma read the words aloud, sunlight streamed through the chamber's hidden skylights, creating rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. The harmonies dawn roses above ground seemed to respond, their melody growing stronger and more complex. "There's more," Julia said, carefully turning the pages. "Look, detailed plans for what she envisioned the Institute becoming. She saw all of this decades ago. The plans showed not just a school or research center, but a place of healing and growth on multiple levels. Catherine had designed spaces where music and nature could work together to help people recover from trauma, where children could learn to hear the songs of the garden, where scientists and artists could collaborate to explore the boundaries between sound and life itself." Victoria, who had been quietly examining one of the modified violins, suddenly gasped. "This marking here, it's identical to the one on the Stradivarius." Catherine wasn't just preserving instruments, she was studying how they were made, trying to understand why certain violins seemed to have almost magical properties. "And she succeeded," Emma said excitedly. "Look at these frequency measurements. The harmonies dawn roses. They're growing in patterns that match the exact resonant frequencies of the Stradivarius. The garden isn't just responding to the music, it's recreating it in living form." Alexander picked up a small wooden box from a dusty shelf. Inside was a collection of seeds, each carefully labeled with musical notations. "Seeds for the future," he read from the attached note, "to be planted when the garden sings in full harmony." Mrs. Henderson, who had been cataloguing the chamber's contents, called them over to a peculiar contraption in the corner. "It's some sort of recording device," she explained, "and there's a cylinder still inside." With trembling hands, Marcus helped her carefully clean and wind the antique machine. When they played it, Catherine's voice filled the chamber, as clear as if she were standing among them. The garden symphony is never truly complete, because life itself is an endless composition. Each generation adds its own notes, its own harmonies. The seeds I've left behind will grow into flowers we can't yet imagine, singing songs we've never heard. That's the true magic of this place. It grows not just with time, but with love, with understanding, with the healing of old wounds and the planting of new dreams. Emma looked around at her family, her mother growing stronger every day, her grandfather's face softened with joy, Victoria's eyes bright with tears of understanding, Marcus's expression full of wonder, and Mrs. Henderson beaming like a proud guardian of this magical place. They had each added their own notes to Catherine's symphony, their own colors to her garden's palette. Outside, the sun was setting, and the garden began its evening song. But now they could hear it with new understanding, the complex harmonies of growth and change, the melodies of healing and hope, the eternal rhythm of life renewing itself. The harmonies' dawn roses glowed with internal light, their petals creating patterns that match the frequencies still echoing from Catherine's recording. "Tomorrow," Emma said softly, "I leave for the conservatory. But this isn't an ending, is it? It's just another movement in the symphony." Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Catherine knew that love, like music, knows no boundaries of time or space. The garden will be here, growing new songs for you to discover when you return. As twilight deepened into evening, the family made their way back to the surface, leaving Catherine's chamber to be properly preserved as part of the Institute. The garden welcomed them with a burst of illumination from the Harmony's dawn roses, their rainbow lights painting the path ahead. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities, new students to teach, new instruments to restore, new harmonies to discover. But the foundation remained constant: the garden's song, the family's love, and Catherine's eternal symphony of hope. On Emma's last evening before leaving for the conservatory, the garden seemed to glow with an inner light. The Harmony's dawn roses had spread throughout the grounds, their rainbow-edged petals creating patterns of light that danced in the twilight air. The family had gathered for a special dinner in the conservatory, now restored to its original glory. "I have something for you," Alexander said, presenting Emma with an elegantly wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover matching Catherine's original notebooks. "For recording your own discoveries," he explained. "The garden's symphony is still evolving, and now you'll be part of writing its future." Julia, looking radiant in her recovery, added her own gift: a delicate silver bracelet with musical note charms. "Each note represents a different flower in the garden," she explained, "so you'll always carry a piece of it with you." Victoria approached with something unexpected: the old student violin she and Catherine had shared as girls. "It's been restored," she said softly. "The Institute will need it eventually, but for now, I think Catherine would want you to have it, for practicing when the Stradivarius should rest." Emma felt tears welling up as she accepted each gift, but it was Mrs. Henderson's present that truly caught her breath: a collection of pressed flowers from the garden, each paired with its corresponding musical notation from Catherine's symphony. "For inspiration," the housekeeper said warmly, "when you're composing your own pieces." Marcus had been quiet throughout the gift-giving, but now he stepped forward with a mysterious smile. "My gift isn't something I can wrap," he said, "but perhaps you'd all like to come see it." He led them to Catherine's underground chamber, which had been carefully preserved and restored. But now something new had been added: a sophisticated recording setup integrated seamlessly with Catherine's original equipment. "The university's helped design it," Marcus explained. "It can detect and record the actual frequencies produced by the plants, combining them with the music played here. Emma, you'll be able to continue Catherine's research even while you're studying at the conservatory. We can send you the garden songs." Emma touched the equipment gently, marveling at how it bridged past and future. "But that's not all," Marcus continued. He pressed a button, and suddenly the chamber was filled with sound, the complex harmonies of the garden above, captured and crystallized into pure audio form. "Listen," Victoria whispered. "You can hear each different rose variety, each strain of jasmine." "The garden's voice," Julia added softly. "Catherine would have loved this." As they stood listening to the garden's symphony, Emma noticed something extraordinary. The Harmony's dawn roses above were responding to their own recorded song, creating new variations of their melody. The music was evolving in real time, growing and changing like a living thing. "That's why the Institute is so important," Alexander said, watching the interplay of sound and growth. "Catherine didn't just create a garden or compose music. She discovered a whole new way for art and nature to communicate." Emma sat at Catherine's old workbench, opening her new journal. On the first page, she wrote, "The garden speaks in many voices now, through music, through light, through the hearts it has helped heal, but most of all it speaks through love." As if in response to her words, a new harmony emerged from the recording equipment, a perfect blend of the Harmony's dawn roses, the evening jasmine, and something else, something that seemed to come from the very soil of the garden itself. "The seeds!" Mrs. Henderson exclaimed. The ones Catherine left for the future, they're sprouting. They hurried back to the garden, where tiny shoots were indeed breaking through the soil in a perfect spiral pattern. Each seedling seemed to glow with a faint, multicolored light, like miniature versions of the Harmony's dawn roses. She knew, Victoria said wonderingly. She knew the garden would need to keep growing, keep changing, just like us. Emma reached for the Stradivarius, feeling called to play in this moment of new beginning. As she drew the bow across the strings, the seedlings responded, their glow intensifying with each note. The existing roses joined in, their own lights pulsing in harmony, creating a visual symphony that matched the music perfectly. Julia moved to the outdoor keyboard that had been installed for her therapy sessions, adding gentle chords that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Victoria picked up Catherine's old violin, and soon 3 generations of music filled the garden, past, present, and future, blending into something entirely new. Alexander watched his family create this impromptu concert, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is what Catherine wanted all along," he said softly. "Not just preservation, but growth. Not just remembrance, but renewal." As twilight deepened into true evening, the garden glowed brighter than ever, each plant adding its own light to the symphony of illumination. The new seedlings continued to grow, already showing signs of becoming something unprecedented. Catherine's final gift to the garden she had loved so well. Emma played until the stars came out, letting her music twine with the garden's song, adding her own voice to its endless symphony. Tomorrow would bring change, challenges, growth. But tonight was for celebrating the incredible journey that had brought them all to this moment of harmony. The morning of Emma's departure dawned clear and bright, the garden sparkling with dew that seemed to capture all the colors of the Harmony's dawn roses. The new seedlings had grown noticeably overnight, their tiny leaves already showing hints of the rainbow patterns that made their parent plants so extraordinary. Before leaving for the train station, Emma had one last task to complete. The entire family gathered in the garden as she prepared to play Catherine's symphony one final time, not as practice or performance, but as a promise to return. "Wait," Victoria said suddenly. She disappeared into the house and returned with a small package wrapped in aged paper. "I found this in Catherine's chamber last night. It's marked, 'For the day the garden's voice travels beyond these walls.'" Inside was a small digital recording device, surprisingly modern for something Catherine had left behind. Attached was a note in her elegant handwriting. "Music, like love, grows best when it's shared. This garden has been my laboratory, my sanctuary, my concert hall, but it was never meant to keep its songs to itself. Take its voice with you, let it blend with new harmonies, and bring back the melodies you discover. The symphony is endless, if we only have the courage to keep playing." Emma placed the device carefully on Catherine's old workbench, now integrated with Marcus's modern recording equipment. As she lifted the Stradivarius to her shoulder, Alexander spoke softly. "Before you begin," he said, "there's something else you should know. The Montgomery Foundation's board met yesterday. They've approved funding for satellite gardens, smaller versions of this one, to be established at healing centers around the country. Each one will be connected to the Institute, sharing music and research. Sharing hope," Julia finished, her eyes shining, just like Catherine always intended. Emma felt overwhelming gratitude as she looked at her assembled family. Her grandfather, standing tall and proud, her mother healthy and radiant, her uncle Marcus, whose quiet strength had helped hold them all together, Victoria, transformed by truth and forgiveness, and Mrs. Henderson, who had kept faith with the garden through all the years of silence. She began to play, and the garden responded with joy. The Harmony's dawn roses glowed brighter than ever, their petals creating patterns of light that danced in the morning air. The new seedlings swayed in time with the music, despite the perfect stillness of the day. As the symphony's final movement approached, something magical happened. The recording equipment captured not just the sound of the violin, but the garden's own voice, a harmony of growing things, of light becoming music, of love made audible. The combination created something entirely new, a piece of music that seemed to contain all the hope and healing power of the garden itself. When the last note faded, Emma carefully packed the Stradivarius in its case. The recording device had captured everything, not just the music, but the garden's response, the subtle songs of the roses, the whispered harmonies of new growth. "It's not goodbye," she said, looking around at her family and the garden that had brought them all together. "It's just a new movement in the symphony." Victoria stepped forward, her usual reserve softened by emotion. Catherine always said that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning. "Look." She pointed to where the morning sun caught the new seedlings, making them glow with unprecedented colors. "The garden is already preparing for your return." Julia hugged her daughter. "Close, and so are we all. The institute will be fully operational by the time you finish your first semester. Your students will be waiting." "My students?" Emma asked, surprised. Alexander smiled. "Of course. Who better to teach the next generation about the connection between music and nature? Catherine may have planted the first seeds, but you've helped them bloom in ways even she might not have imagined." As they prepared to leave for the station, Emma took one last look at the garden. The Harmony's dawn roses were creating new patterns of light, their colors shifting and changing like a visual symphony. The jasmine vines had woven themselves into musical staff patterns along the walls, and the new seedlings reached toward the sun with unwavering determination. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a travel basket. "Musical manuscript paper," she said with a wink, "in case the garden speaks to you while you're away, and some pressed Harmony's dawn petals, the first of their kind, for luck." Marcus started the car as the others gathered their things. But before Emma could take her seat, a sudden burst of light from the garden caught everyone's attention. The new seedlings had produced their first buds, and as they watched in wonder, the flowers began to open. These blooms were unlike anything they'd seen before. Their petals seemed to contain not just light and color, but actual musical notes, visible as shimmering patterns that changed with the angle of sunlight. The garden's symphony had taken physical form, creating flowers that were themselves a kind of living music. "Catherine's final experiment," Victoria breathed. "She found a way to make music visible, to turn harmony into living art." Emma touched one of the new blooms gently, and a clear, pure note rang out through the garden. The sound seemed to contain all the love, hope, and healing power that had transformed Blackwood Manor from a place of shadows into a beacon of light. "The garden will be here when you return," Alexander said softly, "growing new songs for you to discover, new harmonies to explore." As they drove away, Emma looked back at Blackwood Manor through the rear window. The garden was glowing in the morning sun, the new musical flowers adding their voices to its eternal symphony. She had Catherine's journal in her lap, the recording device in her bag, and the garden's song in her heart. The next movement of the symphony was about to begin, and somewhere in the distance, new gardens were waiting to bloom. 3 months into her studies at the conservatory, Emma received a package from home. Inside was a collection of photographs showing the incredible transformation of Blackwood Manor. The Institute's first wing was complete, its glass walls reflecting the garden's light in mesmerizing patterns. But it was the accompanying letter from Mrs. Henderson that made her heart skip a beat. "My dear Emma, you won't believe what your musical flowers have done. The seedlings that sprouted the day you left, they've grown into something extraordinary. The botanists are calling them symphony roses. Each bloom produces its own unique melody when touched by sunlight. But here's the real miracle. They're helping people heal. Your mother's music therapy program has expanded beyond our wildest dreams. The combination of the symphony roses and traditional therapy is showing remarkable results. People who haven't spoken in years are finding their voices. Children with attention difficulties are discovering focus through the garden's harmonies. Victoria has been instrumental in establishing the first satellite garden at the Children's Hospital downtown. The roses took root immediately, as if they knew they were needed there. The doctors can hardly believe the impact. Recovery times are shortening, spirits are lifting, and there's music in every corridor. But I saved the best news for last. Remember that recording you made the morning you left? the one that captured both your playing and the garden's voice. The conservatory's composition department has been studying it, and they've made an astonishing discovery. The harmonic patterns in the garden's song match exactly with what they're calling healing frequencies, specific sound patterns that promote growth and renewal. Your grandfather wants you to know that Catherine's underground chamber has been fully restored and equipped with the latest research technology. Marcus has organized a team of scientists and musicians who are exploring ways to integrate these healing harmonies into traditional medical treatments. The results are promising beyond anything we could have imagined. The institute itself is flourishing. Students arrive daily, eager to learn about musical botany. The original harmonies dawn. Roses have developed new varieties, each with its own unique properties. One type responds specifically to violin music, another to piano, creating a living orchestra in the garden. But perhaps the most touching development involves your great-aunt Victoria. She started teaching music appreciation classes to small groups of children using Catherine's old violin. The garden seems to glow especially bright during these lessons, as if approving of this healing of old wounds. Your mother sends her love, of course. Her health continues to improve, and she's become the Institute's leading advocate for music therapy research. The doctors are amazed by her recovery, though those of us who have witnessed the garden's power are hardly surprised. Alexander spends his mornings in Catherine's chamber, recording the garden's daily symphonies. He says each dawn brings a new movement to the endless composition. The trustees visit regularly, bringing experts from around the world to study this remarkable fusion of music and nature. The new musical flowers you discovered, the ones that emerged just before you left, have become the heart of our research program. Each bloom seems to contain its own unique healing property, activated by specific musical frequencies. It's as if Catherine left us a living pharmacy, with music as the key to unlocking its potential. We've had visitors from renowned medical institutions, conservatories and botanical gardens, all eager to understand what's happening here. But as your grandfather often says, some things can't be measured or quantified. They can only be experienced with an open heart. The garden misses you, dear Emma. We can tell by the way the symphony roses turn toward the east each morning, as if looking for their young composer. But we also know you're exactly where you need to be, learning to expand the boundaries of what music can do. Your room is always ready, and the garden keeps adding new harmonies to its song, saving them for your return. Victoria says she can hear Thomas's violin in the evening breezes sometimes, playing alongside Catherine's eternal symphony. With all our love, Mrs. Henderson and your ever-growing garden family. Emma sat in her dormitory room, surrounded by sheet music and botanical texts, her heart full of joy and purpose. On her desk, pressed between the pages of Catherine's journal, was a petal from one of the original Harmony's dawn roses. It still glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Through her open window came the sounds of the city, traffic, voices, the rhythm of urban life. But underneath it all, if she listened carefully, she could hear the distant echo of the garden song, calling her home to the place where music and nature spoke the same language of healing and hope. She lifted the Stradivarius from its case, inspired to compose something new, a piece that would bridge the distance between her two worlds, between the garden's ancient wisdom and the fresh possibilities of the future. As she played, the pressed rose petal glowed brighter, its light dancing across the pages of her unfinished symphony. 6 months after Emma's departure, the first international symposium on musical botany was held at Blackwood Manor. Scientists, musicians and healers from around the world gathered to witness the miracle of the garden and its symphony roses. Emma returned home for the event, her heart soaring as she passed through the gates of the estate. The garden had flourished beyond her wildest dreams. The symphony roses now grew in elaborate patterns, their blooms creating natural amphitheaters where music and light danced together. The jasmine vines had woven themselves into living treble clefs along the walls, and Catherine's original twilight, roses stood proud and tall, watching over their magical descendants. "Welcome home, dear," Mrs. Henderson greeted her with a warm embrace. "Someone's been waiting for you." In the center of the garden, a new variety of symphony rose had blossomed, one unlike any other. Its petals were crystalline, almost transparent, with threads of gold running through them like musical staff lines. As Emma approached, it began to sing, a perfect harmony to the melody she had been composing at the conservatory. "It started growing the day you wrote your new piece," Alexander explained, appearing beside her. "Somehow, the garden knew. It's been saving this song for you." The symposium opened that evening with a special performance. Emma stood in the garden's central amphitheater, the Stradivarius tucked under her chin, surrounded by the glowing symphony roses. As she began to play her new composition, a piece that blended Catherine's original symphony with her own discoveries, the garden came alive with music and light. Each rose added its voice to the symphony, creating a three-dimensional orchestra of sound and illumination. The transparent roses caught and refracted the light, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the assembled audience. Even Victoria's eyes shone with tears as she recognized phrases from the songs she and Catherine had played together as girls. Julia, strong and vibrant, sat at the new grand piano installed in the garden, adding her own voice to the performance. The roses responded to her touch as much as to Emma's violin, creating a harmony that seemed to reach into every heart present. Marcus stood with the research team, their instruments recording this unprecedented fusion of music, light, and life. The data would be studied for years to come, but the magic of the moment needed no scientific explanation. It could be felt in the soul. As the performance reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened. The transparent roses began to multiply, their crystalline blooms opening in waves that rippled outward from the amphitheater. Each new flower added its own note to the symphony, building a harmony so complex and beautiful that it brought tears to every eye. "Look!" someone gasped. The light from the roses had begun to form patterns in the air, visible music, just as Catherine had dreamed. The garden was singing not just with sound, but with pure light, creating a symphony that could be seen as well as heard. When the final notes faded, the audience sat in stunned silence before erupting in applause. But Emma's attention was drawn to a quiet corner of the garden, where a single new shoot had pushed through the soil. Its leaves were unlike any they'd seen before, shaped like tiny golden bells that chimed softly in the evening breeze. "The garden symphony is never really complete," she said, remembering Catherine's words. "It just keeps growing, changing, creating new songs for those who are ready to hear them." Victoria stepped forward, Catherine's old violin in her hands. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it's time for a duet." As aunt and niece played together, their music weaving through the garden's own song, Emma felt the truth of Catherine's vision more strongly than ever. The garden wasn't just a place of healing or a scientific marvel. It was a living testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the eternal dance between art and nature. Alexander watched his family create this new harmony, his face glowing with pride and joy. Julia added her piano to the duet, while Marcus conducted the symphony roses with subtle gestures, their light pulsing in time with the music. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of the mansion, now transformed into the thriving institute, watching the dream she had helped protect finally bloom in full. The garden had become more than any of them could have imagined, a place where science and art merged, where healing touched both body and soul, where the past and future sang together in perfect harmony. And at its heart, the transparent roses continued to grow, their crystalline blooms capturing and transforming light into music, music into healing, and healing into hope. As twilight deepened into evening, the garden glowed with its own inner light, a beacon of possibility in a world hungry for harmony. Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Catherine's legacy would continue to grow and evolve, touching lives far beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor, creating new symphonies for generations to come. The garden's song had only just begun. The success of the International Symposium transformed Blackwood Manor's reputation overnight. What had once been a mysterious old estate was now being hailed as the birthplace of a new scientific and artistic frontier. Universities and research institutions around the world were requesting symphony rose seedlings eager to study their remarkable properties. One morning, as Emma helped prepare a shipment of roses for a children's hospital in London, she discovered something remarkable. Each rose, when carefully packed with a recording of the garden's music, seemed to retain its connection to Blackwood Manor. The flowers would bloom in synchronization, regardless of distance, creating a network of harmony that spanned continents. "It's extraordinary," Marcus exclaimed, reviewing the data from the satellite gardens. "The roses aren't just growing. They're communicating with each other through music. Every garden we establish becomes part of a larger symphony." Victoria, who had taken charge of the Institute's outreach program, brought news from the first satellite location at the Children's Hospital. "The doctors are amazed," she reported, her eyes bright with purpose. "Children who were previously unresponsive are beginning to engage when exposed to the roses' music. It's as if the flowers know exactly what harmony each person needs to heal." The Institute itself had become a hub of innovation. Julia's music therapy program had expanded to include specialized treatments using different varieties of symphony roses. Each strain seemed suited to particular conditions. Some calmed anxiety, others improved focus, and still others helped with physical rehabilitation. "Look at this," Alexander said one afternoon, showing Emma a letter from a prestigious medical journal. "They want to feature the Institute's work in a special edition about alternative healing methods. Catherine's dream of combining music and nature is revolutionizing modern medicine." Mrs. Henderson had taken on the role of head gardener, training a new generation of musical botanists. Under her guidance, the garden continued to evolve, producing new varieties of flowers that responded to different types of music. A particularly fascinating development was a species that reacted specifically to human voices, encouraging people to express themselves through song. Emma split her time between her studies at the conservatory and her work at the Institute, finding that each enriched the other. Her professors were fascinated by her discoveries about the relationship between musical frequencies and plant growth, while her understanding of classical composition helped her decode more of Catherine's botanical innovations. One evening, as she practiced in the garden with the Stradivarius, she noticed something unprecedented. The transparent roses that had appeared during the symposium began to change color in response to specific notes. As she played different pieces, they created patterns of light that corresponded perfectly to the emotional tenor of the music. "They're not just responding to sound," Julia observed, watching the display. "They're interpreting it, translating music into visible emotion." Victoria, who had been documenting the roses' behaviors, added her own insight. "Catherine once told me that music was just light we couldn't see, and light was music we couldn't hear. These roses are proving her right. They're bridging the gap between sound and sight." The implications were staggering. Researchers began studying how the roses' light patterns could help people with hearing impairments experience music visually. Musicians collaborated with botanists to create new compositions specifically designed to elicit particular growth patterns and color displays. Alexander spent hours in Catherine's underground chamber, now equipped with state-of-the-art recording technology. He was creating an archive of the garden's songs, preserving each new harmony as it emerged. "Every day brings a new movement to the symphony," he said. "It's as if Catherine left us an endless composition, one that grows and changes with each generation." As word of the Institute's work spread, visitors began arriving from around the world, artists seeking inspiration, scientists pursuing breakthrough research, and people simply looking for healing all found their way to Blackwood Manor's magical garden. One particularly touching moment came when a group of music students from an underprivileged school visited the Institute. Victoria, who had once valued only wealth and social status, spent the entire day teaching them about the garden's harmonies. The joy on their faces as they coaxed melodies from the symphony roses brought tears to her eyes. "Catherine would have loved this," she told Emma later. "She always said music belonged to everyone, that it was the universal language of the heart." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple reminiscent of the original Catherine's twilight roses, Emma sat in the garden recording a new discovery. The transparent roses had begun producing seedlings that grew in perfect musical intervals, creating living scales that bloomed in sequence. Each new development seemed to confirm what they had all come to understand, that Catherine's vision had been far larger than any of them had initially realized. She hadn't just created a magical garden or composed a remarkable symphony. She had discovered a new way for humanity to connect with the natural world, a harmony that could heal both people and the planet itself. As the Institute's first year drew to a close, the garden prepared for a special celebration. The original Catherine's twilight roses were about to bloom in unprecedented numbers, their unique purple-to-white gradation creating waves of color throughout the grounds. But it was the symphony roses that truly captured everyone's attention. Each variety had developed its own distinct personality. The transparent roses now created complex light shows that responded to the emotions of people nearby. The musical flowers that grew in intervals had formed natural amphitheaters, their blooms arranged in perfect acoustic patterns. And the newest variety, dubbed Rainbow Symphony, produced blooms that changed color and tone based on the time of day, creating a constant, evolving melody. "We've received confirmation from all the satellite gardens," Marcus announced during a morning meeting. "They're experiencing synchronized blooming patterns. It's as if all the symphony roses, no matter where they're planted, remember they're part of one great orchestra." Julia, whose music therapy program had become a model for similar initiatives worldwide, shared her own exciting news. The World Health Organization is interested in establishing symphony rose gardens in hospitals globally. They've seen the data from our research, the improvement rates, the reduced recovery times, the emotional benefits. Victoria, who had fully embraced her role as the Institute's outreach coordinator, added, "And the conservatory wants to establish a permanent exchange program. Students would split their time between traditional music studies and learning about musical botany here." Emma sat in Catherine's underground chamber, now a state-of-the-art research facility, reviewing the latest findings. The garden's influence had spread far beyond anything they had imagined. Symphony roses were helping trauma survivors find their voices, allowing children with special needs to experience music in new ways, and providing peaceful environments for healing and growth. Alexander joined her, carrying a newly discovered notebook of Catherine's. "Look at this," he said excitedly. Catherine predicted everything: the synchronized blooming, the light patterns, even the therapeutic applications. "But there's more." He pointed to a passage near the end. "When the garden's voice reaches its full strength, it will reveal its greatest secret. A harmony that can bridge not just music and nature, but past and future, sorrow and joy, separation and unity." As if in response to these words, a new sound began to emerge from the garden above. Emma and Alexander rushed outside to find an extraordinary sight. The symphony roses were creating a spontaneous concert, each variety contributing its own voice to a complex melody that seemed to contain echoes of every piece ever played in the garden. Mrs. Henderson, who had been tending to the newest seedlings, stood transfixed. "Listen," she whispered. "You can hear Catherine's original symphony, but also Thomas's violin pieces, Emma's compositions, Victoria's childhood duets." The music grew stronger as more people gathered in the garden. Julia's therapy students, who had been practicing nearby, added their voices. Victoria began to play Catherine's old violin, and the roses responded by intensifying their light patterns, creating auroras of color that danced through the evening air. Marcus's recording equipment captured everything, not just the sounds and lights, but also the subtle vibrations that showed how the plants were communicating with each other. The data would be studied for years to come, but the magic of the moment needed no scientific explanation. Emma lifted the Stradivarius to her shoulder, feeling called to add her own voice to the garden's song. As she played, she understood what Catherine had meant about the garden's greatest secret. The harmony surrounding them wasn't just about music or plants or healing. It was about connection, about the invisible threads that bound all living things together. The symphony roses bloomed brighter than ever, their petals creating patterns that mirrored the constellations above. The garden had become a bridge between earth and sky, past and future, science and art. It was exactly what Catherine had envisioned, a place where all forms of life could speak the same language of harmony and hope. As twilight deepened into evening, the garden continued its spontaneous symphony. Visitors who had come for tours stood mesmerized by the display. Students recorded the phenomenon with wondering eyes. Scientists scratched hasty notes, trying to document this unprecedented convergence of music, light, and life. But for the family at the heart of it all, Emma, Alexander, Julia, Victoria, Marcus, and Mrs. Henderson, it was simply confirmation of what they had known all along. The garden's magic had never been about just music or plants or healing. It had been about love, about family, about the endless possibility of growth and renewal. The symphony roses glowed like stars brought down to earth, their light pulsing in time with the universal heartbeat that Catherine had first recognized so many years ago. And in their melody was a promise that as long as there were people willing to listen, to grow, to heal, the garden's song would continue, bringing hope and harmony to a world in need of both. As winter approached, Blackwood Manor prepared for an unprecedented event. The symphony roses, defying all normal botanical behavior, continued to bloom despite the cold. Their music had grown richer, deeper, as if the garden was gathering strength for something extraordinary. Emma, now in her final year at the conservatory, had returned home for what the Institute was calling the Winter Symphony, a phenomenon Catherine had predicted in her last journals but had never lived to see. According to her notes, once, every generation, the garden would reach its full potential, creating a harmony so powerful it could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. "Look at this," Marcus said one morning, showing Emma the latest satellite data. "The symphony roses in every garden we've established are responding to each other. They're creating a global network of music and light." The Institute had become a beacon of hope for people around the world. Stories poured in daily of miraculous recoveries, of communities united through the garden's music, of children finding their voices through interaction with the musical flowers. Victoria's outreach program had expanded to include virtual concerts where symphony roses in different continents bloomed in synchronization, their harmonies bridging vast distances. One particularly cold morning, as frost painted delicate patterns on the garden's glass enclosures, Emma made an extraordinary discovery. The transparent roses had begun producing crystalline seeds that seemed to contain their own light source. When placed in water, these seeds created ripples that moved in perfect musical intervals. "It's as if they're distilling pure harmony," Julia observed, watching the seeds pulse with inner light. Catherine's vision of music becoming visible, becoming tangible. Alexander spent hours in the underground chamber, now expanded into a full research facility, studying the new development. "These seeds," he explained to a gathering of scientists and musicians, "carry not just genetic information, but actual musical sequences. They're like nature's own recording devices." Mrs. Henderson, who had developed an almost mystical connection with the garden over the years, noticed something else. "The original Catherine's twilight roses," she said one evening. "They're changing. Look at the color." Indeed, the signature purple to white gradation had begun to incorporate new hues, subtle rainbow shadows that shifted and changed like aurora borealis. When Emma played the Stradivarius nearby, the colors danced in perfect harmony with the music. As the winter solstice approached, the garden's activity intensified. The symphony roses began emitting pulses of light that created complex patterns in the air like visible sound waves. The crystalline seeds multiplied, each one containing its own unique melody, while the transparent roses formed natural prisms that transformed sunlight into music. Victoria, who had once sought to suppress the garden's secrets, now worked tirelessly to share its gifts with the world. Her foundation had established scholarships for students of musical botany, ensuring that Catherine's discoveries would continue to evolve through future generations. "I understand now," she told Emma one evening, as they watched the garden's light show from the conservatory. "Catherine wasn't just creating something beautiful. She was showing us a new way to heal, to grow, to connect. The garden isn't just a place, It's a bridge between worlds. The Winter Symphony itself began subtly, a soft harmony that emerged from the heart of the garden as the solstice sun touched the horizon. The symphony roses began to glow with unprecedented brightness, their light forming auroras that danced above the manor. The crystalline seeds released their stored music, creating a symphony that combined every melody ever played in the garden. Visitors from around the world had gathered to witness the event. Scientists recorded data they couldn't explain, while musicians felt their understanding of harmony forever changed. But it was the garden's effect on people that proved most remarkable. As the music played, barriers seemed to dissolve. Strangers found themselves sharing stories, healing old wounds, forming connections that would last lifetimes. Emma stood in the center of it all, the Stradivarius in her hands, feeling the garden's pulse merge with her own heartbeat. She understood now what Catherine had meant about the garden's true purpose. It wasn't just about creating beautiful music or magical flowers. It was about showing humanity its own potential for harmony. As the Winter Symphony reached its peak, the garden seemed to sing with all the voices it had ever known. Catherine's original compositions, Thomas's violin pieces, Emma's new harmonies, and countless others who had contributed to its endless song. The symphony roses glowed like earthbound stars, their light reaching toward the heavens as if to bridge the gap between ground and sky, past and future, separation and unity. In that moment, Emma felt the full weight of her grandmother's legacy. Catherine hadn't just created a magical garden, she had planted the seeds of a new way of being, a harmony that could heal not just individual hearts, but the very fabric of human connection itself. The success of the Winter Symphony marked a new chapter for Blackwood Manor and the Institute. The garden's influence had grown far beyond anything Catherine could have imagined, touching lives across the globe. But it was the personal transformations that proved most profound. On a crisp spring morning, as Emma prepared for her final performance at the conservatory, she found Alexander in Catherine's chamber, surrounded by years of research and documentation. "We've only scratched the surface," he said, looking up from a stack of papers. "Every answer leads to new questions. Every discovery opens new possibilities. The garden keeps growing, keeps teaching us." The Institute had become a center for innovation in multiple fields. Julia's music therapy program had revolutionized treatment approaches worldwide. Marcus's research team had documented unprecedented breakthroughs in plant communication and healing frequencies. Victoria's outreach initiatives had brought symphony roses to communities that had never known such beauty. "Look at this," Mrs. Henderson called from the garden. A new variety of symphony rose had appeared, one with petals that seemed to be made of pure light. When the sun touched them, they created holograms of musical notes in the air, turning the garden into a three-dimensional musical score. "Catherine's ultimate vision," Victoria breathed, watching the display. "The perfect fusion of music, light, and life." The garden itself had evolved into something beyond their understanding. The symphony roses communicated across continents, creating a network of harmony that scientists could measure but not fully explain. The crystalline seeds had started growing in patterns that matched mathematical constants, phi, pi, the golden ratio, as if nature itself was revealing its underlying music. Emma's final composition for the conservatory was a piece that incorporated all she had learned from the garden. It wasn't just music, it was a bridge between art and science, between human creativity and nature's wisdom. When she performed, the symphony roses across the world bloomed in synchronization, their light and music reaching across time zones and cultures. Alexander had finally completed Catherine's archive, documenting every discovery, every innovation, every moment of magic the garden had produced. But more importantly, he had documented the human stories, the healings, the connections, the transformations that had occurred in this extraordinary place. "Your grandmother knew," he told Emma one evening as they watched the sunset paint the garden in golden light. "She knew that the real magic wasn't in the flowers or the music alone, but in what they helped people discover about themselves." The garden continued to grow and change, each season bringing new wonders. The transparent roses developed the ability to store and replay memories in the form of light and sound. The musical flowers learned to harmonize with human emotions, creating personalized symphonies of healing and hope. Victoria, who had once tried to bury the garden's secrets, now worked to ensure they would be shared with future generations. She established a foundation to protect and propagate symphony roses worldwide, focusing particularly on areas affected by conflict or natural disasters. "Music knows no boundaries," she often said, echoing Catherine's words. "It speaks the language of the heart." And now, thanks to these remarkable flowers, we can see that language made visible. Julia's recovery had become a symbol of the garden's healing power. She now led international conferences on music therapy, demonstrating how the combination of traditional techniques and symphony roses could accelerate healing and promote emotional well-being. Marcus continued to push the boundaries of research, collaborating with scientists around the world to understand the deeper implications of Catherine's discoveries. The garden had become a bridge between disciplines, biology, physics, music, psychology, revealing connections that had always existed but had never been seen before. Mrs. Henderson, now training the next generation of musical botanists, often said that the garden's greatest gift was its ability to surprise them. Even after years of study and observation, new varieties of symphony roses would appear, each with its own unique properties and purpose. As Emma prepared to take her place as the Institute's lead researcher, combining her musical training with her inherited understanding of the garden's magic, she realized that Catherine's legacy was far greater than any of them had initially understood. The garden wasn't just a place of beauty or healing, it was a living demonstration of the harmony possible between all things. The symphony roses continued to bloom, their light and music reaching out to a world increasingly in need of both. And in their endless song, people found what Catherine had always known they would: the rhythm of life itself, the melody of connection, the harmony that existed between all living things. The day of Emma's official installation as the Institute's Director of Musical Botany dawned bright and clear. The garden was in full bloom, every variety of symphony rose adding its voice to nature's orchestra. The transparent roses created dancing lights that painted the air with music, while the crystalline flowers chimed gentle harmonies in the morning breeze. In the years since Emma had first discovered her grandmother's legacy, Blackwood Manor had transformed from a place of shadows and secrets into a beacon of hope and healing. The Institute's influence had spread across the globe, with symphony rose gardens bringing comfort and renewal to countless lives. "Your grandmother would be proud," Alexander said, adjusting Emma's doctoral robes as they prepared for the ceremony. "You've taken her vision further than she could have imagined." The Great Hall was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the garden's magic. Julia, now a renowned expert in musical therapy, sat beside Victoria, who had found her own healing through sharing the garden's gifts with others. Marcus, his research having earned international acclaim, stood with a group of scientists who had helped document the symphony rose's remarkable properties. Mrs. Henderson, her face glowing with pride, had arranged special bouquets of Catherine's twilight roses and Harmony's dawn blooms throughout the hall. Each flower seemed to pulse with its own inner light, creating a living rainbow that danced across the walls. As Emma took her place at the podium, the Stradivarius tucked carefully. Under her arm, she looked out at the faces before her, family, friends, colleagues, and visitors from around the world. But more than that, she felt the presence of those who had come before. Catherine's vision, Thomas's passion, and the love that had brought them all together. "The garden has taught us many things," she began, her voice clear and strong. "About music, about healing, about the connections that exist between all living things. But perhaps its greatest lesson has been about love, how it grows, how it heals, how it transforms everything it touches." As if in response to her words, the symphony roses began their own concert. Each variety contributed its unique voice to the harmony, the transparent roses creating visual music that floated through the air, the crystalline blooms adding their bell-like tones, and the newest varieties painting sound shapes that danced above the audience. "We stand at the beginning of a new chapter," Emma continued. The Institute isn't just a research facility or a school, it's a bridge between worlds, between science and art, between nature and humanity, between past and future. She lifted the Stradivarius and began to play Catherine's symphony, but now it was different. Enriched by all they had learned, all they had discovered, all they had become. The garden responded with joy, every flower adding its voice to the music, creating a harmony that touched every heart in the room. Alexander watched his granddaughter with tears in his eyes, remembering the lost and angry man he had been before. She arrived. Victoria held Catherine's old violin, finally at peace with her past. Julia's hands moved across the piano keys, adding her own voice to the symphony. Marcus recorded everything with wonder, while Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly, as if she had always known this day would come. As the music reached its crescendo, something magical happened. The symphony roses throughout the garden began to produce new blooms, flowers unlike any they had seen before. These blooms seemed to contain entire galaxies in their petals, their music echoing with the harmony of the spheres themselves. "Catherine's final gift," Victoria whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. The garden isn't just about healing the past or celebrating the present. It's about growing into the future, endless possibilities blooming like these new roses. The ceremony concluded with a global synchronized blooming of symphony roses, every garden they had established around the world joining in the celebration. The music they created together was a promise of healing, of growth, of the endless capacity for renewal that existed in every heart. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Emma stood in the garden where her journey had begun. The place where she had once knelt in the dirt, trying to bring life back to abandoned flowers, was now a symphony of light and sound and endless possibility. "The garden song is never finished," she said softly, remembering Catherine's words. "It just keeps growing, changing, teaching us new harmonies." The symphony roses glowed in response, their light reaching toward the stars like a bridge between heaven and earth. In their endless song was everything Catherine had dreamed of: healing for the broken, hope for the lost, and love that could transform the world one heart at a time. And so the garden continued to grow, its music touching lives across the globe, its flowers blooming with new wonders every day. The legacy of Catherine Montgomery lived on, not just in the symphony roses or the Institute's research, but in the harmony that had finally bloomed in all their hearts. For in the end, that was what the garden had always been about. Not just music or flowers or healing, but the endless symphony of love that connected all living things, a song that would continue to grow and change and bloom forever and always.